The night air over the Nile River was still warm long after the sun had disappeared behind the western desert. A soft wind moved slowly across the dark water, carrying the smell of wet reeds and river mud through the sleeping villages along the banks. Far away, somewhere beyond the palm trees, a dog barked once and then became quiet again. Small lamps flickered behind windows made from woven reeds. A few tired workers still sat outside their homes in silence, letting the cooler night air rest against their skin after another long day beneath the heavy Egyptian sun. Most homes were already dark. Inside mud brick houses, entire families slept together on woven mats laid across hard floors. Sandals rested near doorways. Clay jars stood against the walls beside baskets of grain and folded linen cloth. The last cooking fires had burned low hours ago, leaving only the faint smell of bread and smoke drifting through narrow streets. Children slept there too. Some were only 5 or 6 years old, curled beside younger brothers and sisters beneath thin blankets. Others were already old enough to rise before dawn and begin working beside their parents. In ancient Egypt, childhood moved quietly and quickly. It was not protected for very long. There was little space between being young and becoming useful. And so many children crossed that invisible line before they fully understood it. The river continued its slow movement beneath the moonlight. Water touched softly against fishing boats tied to wooden poles near the shore. Somewhere in the darkness, an exhausted fisherman adjusted his net before finally lying down to sleep. Tomorrow would begin early again, just as it always did. For most families, every day depended on labor. The fields had to be watered. The grain had to be carried. Bread had to be baked before sunrise. Mud bricks had to dry beneath the heat. Linen had to be woven. Animals had to be fed. Fish had to be cleaned before the air became too hot. And because life demanded so much work, children were slowly pulled into the rhythm of adult life almost as soon as they could walk steadily beside their parents. A boy might begin by carrying water in small jars from the riverbank. At first the jars were light enough for his thin arms. He would walk carefully across dusty paths while morning birds called from the reeds. The cool mud beneath his feet felt soft before the desert heat arrived. He tried not to spill the water while his mother walked ahead carrying much heavier jars balanced carefully against her shoulders. No one would speak of this as training for adulthood. It was simply life. A little girl might sit beside her grandmother during the quiet hours before dawn while bread dough was pressed and shaped by hand. She would watch the careful movements silently at first. Then slowly she would begin helping. Small hands learned quickly. Grain dust settled into her hair and onto her skin. Warm ovens glowed against the dark walls of the kitchen space while smoke drifted upward through holes in the ceiling. These moments felt ordinary to everyone around them. No ceremony announced that childhood was ending. There was no single morning when a parent gently explained that playtime was over forever. Instead, the world itself slowly changed around children until they found themselves standing inside adult routines before they were fully grown. In the earliest hours of morning, long before sunrise, villages beside the Nile slowly began to wake again. Roosters cried into the darkness. Donkeys shifted restlessly in small pens beside houses. Workers rose from sleep with stiff muscles and tired eyes. The air still carried some coolness then, though everyone knew the heat would soon return. Children woke with the adults. Many families could not afford rest for the young. Food was precious. Grain harvests depended on strong hands. Every member of the household mattered. Even very small children carried responsibilities within the home. Some swept floors with bundles of reeds. Others gathered dried animal dung for cooking fires. Some watched younger siblings while mothers worked outside. Older boys followed fathers into the fields where long hours waited beneath the open sky. The Nile itself shaped much of this life. Each year the river flooded the land, leaving dark fertile soil behind when the waters pulled away. Farmers depended completely on this cycle. During flood seasons, some workers repaired tools or helped build temples and tombs for the state. During planting seasons, nearly every available hand became important. Children learned these rhythms early. A young boy standing beside his father in the fields would feel wet earth pressing between his toes while birds circled overhead searching for insects in freshly turned soil. He learned how deeply seeds should be pressed into the ground. He learned how to guide oxen slowly across muddy land. He learned how to watch the sky for signs of weather. Most importantly, he learned how to endure. The heat of Egypt could be exhausting even for strong adults. By midday, sunlight pressed down like a heavy weight over the fields and villages. Workers wrapped cloth around their heads and necks to protect themselves. Sweat covered their skin. Sand clung to their ankles. Water became warm inside clay jars left beneath the sun. Children felt this same exhaustion. There were no separate easier worlds prepared for them. And yet, despite the hard labor, there were still moments of softness hidden inside daily life. During quiet evenings after work, families sometimes gathered outside their homes where cooler air moved gently through the streets. Older relatives told stories beneath the stars while children rested sleepily nearby. Someone might play a simple reed flute. Bread and onions were shared slowly. Laughter rose softly for a little while before fatigue settled over everyone again. Life was difficult, but it was also deeply human. In wealthier homes, childhood could last slightly longer. The sons of scribes or officials sometimes avoided the hardest physical labor. Instead, they spent long hours learning to read and write beneath the watchful eyes of teachers. But even these children entered adult expectations early. Scribe schools were strict places. Young boys sat cross-legged on floors with wooden writing boards balanced on their knees. Reed pens scratched across surfaces coated with thin layers of plaster. Teachers demanded discipline. Mistakes were corrected sharply. Lessons lasted for many hours inside hot rooms where air barely moved. The boys copied lines again and again until their fingers cramped. Writing was one of the few paths toward a less physically painful future. A successful scribe might avoid the brutal labor of farming or construction. Because of this, parents pushed sons toward education with great seriousness. Childhood comfort mattered less than survival later in life. Ancient writings sometimes reveal how adults viewed this process. One old Egyptian instruction text described the lives of laborers in exhausting detail. The stoneworker was covered in dust. The fisherman faced crocodiles and deep water. The laundry worker stood bent over the river all day beneath the burning sun. The message was clear. Study hard now, because adult life could become painfully difficult. Even children heard these warnings. And so they learned quickly. Girls in wealthier households often trained in domestic management from an early age. They watched servants prepare food, organize supplies, weave cloth, and manage household tasks. Marriage sometimes arrived very young, especially for girls. By their early teenage years, many were already expected to care for homes and children of their own. The movement from child to adult happened quietly and steadily. There was little waiting. In poorer communities, the line disappeared even earlier. Hunger and survival left little room for long-protected youth. A child who could carry baskets or clean fish or shape clay became part of the household economy immediately. Near the riverbanks, fishing villages woke before dawn almost every day. Thin boats slid silently across dark water while mist still hovered over the Nile. Fathers brought sons with them to learn the work. Nets had to be untangled carefully. Fish flapped heavily against wooden floors. Water soaked their clothing while mosquitoes drifted through the humid air. Some boys were frightened at first by the deep river and its hidden dangers. Crocodiles lived there. Hippos sometimes overturned boats. Sudden currents pulled strongly against small hands. But fear itself had little place in daily survival. Children adapted because everyone around them expected adaptation. Along busy streets in larger cities, workshops filled with noise as the sun climbed higher. Metal workers hammered bronze tools beneath open roofs. Potters shaped wet clay beside spinning wheels. Carpenters cut wood while sawdust floated through shafts of sunlight. Apprentices, many still children, moved constantly through these crowded spaces carrying supplies and observing skilled workers. The smell of smoke, sweat, wood, oil, and heated metal filled the air. A child apprentice might spend years performing simple exhausting tasks before learning the true craft. He swept floors, prepared tools, carried heavy materials, watched silently from the corners of workshops. Slowly, through repetition and observation, adulthood formed around him piece by piece. No one asked whether he was ready. The work itself decided. At night, after endless hours of labor, tired bodies returned home through streets slowly cooling beneath the evening sky. Dust covered feet and clothing. Shoulders ached. Hands were rough from tools and rope and stone. Children walked beside adults carrying the same exhaustion. Inside homes, simple meals waited. Bread, lentils, beer made from grain, sometimes onions or dried fish. Wealthier families enjoyed more variety, but most ordinary workers lived on basic foods that filled the stomach enough to continue another day. Then came sleep. Deep heavy sleep beneath warm darkness. The ancient world could be painfully loud during daylight hours. Animals cried. Merchants argued in crowded markets. Builders shouted across construction sites. Boats scraped against docks. Tools struck stone endlessly beneath the sun. But nighttime was different. Night softened everything. The air cooled slowly. Oil lamps flickered gently inside homes. Conversations became quieter. Workers rested aching muscles while children drifted into sleep almost immediately after eating. Beyond the villages, the desert stretched silently beneath enormous stars. For many children, these nighttime hours were the closest thing to peace. Because morning always returned quickly. A young girl waking before sunrise might immediately begin grinding grain using a heavy stone grinder. The motion repeated over and over while dust filled the air around her. Her shoulders grew sore from the work. Nearby, her mother prepared ovens for baking while younger siblings still slept. A young boy might already be walking toward fields with farming tools balanced against his shoulder while dawn slowly brightened the horizon pink and gold. The transition into adulthood was not announced through birthdays. It happened through routine. One day a child carried smaller jars. Later the jars became heavier. One day a child watched bread being prepared. Later they prepared it themselves. One day a child followed adults into fields or workshops. Later they led younger children there too. The ancient Egyptian world depended on continuity. Skills passed quietly between generations through repetition and observation. Most knowledge was never written down. It lived inside tired hands and daily habits. Children inherited these habits almost automatically. And because life expectancy was uncertain, adulthood often arrived early out of necessity. Illness spread easily through crowded settlements. Infections from small injuries could become dangerous. Childbirth was risky. Famine sometimes followed poor harvests. Workers injured on construction sites or in fields might never fully recover. Families understood how fragile life could be. Perhaps this is one reason children were prepared for responsibility so early. Survival required readiness. Every pair of hands mattered. Yet even within this difficult world, children still found brief hidden moments for themselves. A group of boys might splash in shallow river water after finishing chores beneath the burning afternoon heat. Girls might sing softly together while grinding grain or weaving linen. Small games appeared between tasks. Laughter still existed in narrow dusty streets. Human beings always find tiny spaces for joy. Even in hard worlds. The moon rose slowly again over the Nile while villages settled into another night. Somewhere a mother rocked a crying infant beneath dim candlelight. Somewhere an elderly grandfather rubbed sore knees after decades of labor beneath the Egyptian sun. Somewhere a child lay awake for a few moments listening to insects outside the house and distant water moving softly through irrigation canals. Tomorrow would bring more work. More heat. More growing. And without fully noticing it, that child would continue moving quietly toward adulthood, step by step, beside the endless flowing river that shaped nearly every moment of ancient Egyptian life. Before the first light appeared over the eastern horizon, the villages along the Nile already carried the quiet movement of waking life. Darkness still rested over the mud brick homes, but inside them people stirred slowly from sleep. A low cough echoed through one narrow room. Somewhere nearby, dry reeds crackled as a cooking fire was brought gently back to life. The smell of smoke mixed with cool river air drifting through open doorways. Children woke to these sounds every morning. There were no separate sleeping chambers filled with comfort or silence for most families. Entire households shared small spaces together. Babies slept beside grandparents. Older brothers stretched across woven mats near the walls. In the hottest months, some families even slept outside beneath the open sky where the night breeze offered a little relief from the heavy heat trapped inside the homes. A child often woke already tired. The days were long, and rest was never fully complete. Mosquitoes hummed through the darkness near the river. Infants cried during the night. Workers returned home late with aching muscles and rose again before sunrise. The rhythm of labor left little room for deep uninterrupted sleep. Still, morning arrived. A boy of perhaps 9 years old stepped carefully outside while the village remained mostly dark. The ground beneath his sandals felt cool for the moment. Above him, stars still covered the sky in pale silver patterns. He carried 2 small clay jars suspended from a wooden pole balanced across his shoulders. The jars were not yet large enough for a grown man, but they were heavier than the ones he carried only a year earlier. Without speaking much, he followed older workers toward the riverbank. Everyone moved quietly at this hour. Voices stayed low. Bodies still felt heavy from yesterday's labor. Along the path, other children appeared carrying baskets, tools, or bundles of reeds. Some rubbed sleep from their eyes while walking. The Nile waited in darkness beside them. Its surface reflected faint moonlight while small ripples moved against the shore. Reeds bent softly in the breeze. Water birds stood silently near the edge, barely visible against the dark river mud. The smell of wet earth rose gently into the cool morning air. The boy knelt carefully to fill the jars. His hands already knew the movement well. Water splashed softly against clay while insects drifted above the surface. Nearby, older women filled much larger containers balanced expertly against their hips and shoulders. Years of labor had shaped their posture and movements into something smooth and practiced. No one hurried. Ancient mornings often began slowly before the full force of the heat arrived. Back inside the homes, cooking fires brightened the dim rooms with orange light. Women and girls prepared the first bread of the day while grain was ground into flour between heavy stones. The grinding sound became part of morning itself in Egyptian settlements. A steady rough rhythm repeated endlessly from one household to another. Children learned these sounds before they understood words fully. A young girl sat beside her mother turning grain beneath the grinder stone. Her small arms tired quickly, though she tried not to complain. Fine dust covered her fingers and clung to her hair. Sweat already formed along her forehead from the effort. Outside, the horizon slowly brightened. The eastern sky became pale gold beyond the palm trees and distant fields. Birds cried out from the reeds. Donkeys brayed impatiently. Somewhere farther away, fishermen pushed narrow boats into the river while mist still hovered above the water. The world was waking again. For many children, these early hours contained some of the hardest work of the day. Before the sun climbed too high, tasks had to be completed quickly. Farmers needed to reach fields while temperatures remained bearable. Bakers prepared bread before ovens became unbearable with heat. Merchants organized goods before crowded market streets filled with noise and dust. Children became part of this machinery of daily life almost without question. A boy walking beside his father toward the fields might carry wooden farming tools nearly as tall as himself. His feet gathered dust with every step along narrow paths between irrigation canals. Frogs slipped quietly into the water as they passed. The smell of damp soil mixed with the scent of growing grain. His father rarely explained the work directly anymore. At a certain age, explanation faded into expectation. The boy was expected to observe carefully and repeat what he saw. He watched how seeds were scattered by hand. He watched how water gates were opened and closed along canals. He learned how deeply the soil should be turned after floods. Every season repeated the same lessons slowly until they became permanent inside the body. This was how many children learned adulthood in ancient Egypt. Not through speeches. Not through ceremonies. But through repetition beneath the sun. By midday, the heat settled heavily across the land. Air shimmered above stone roads and dry fields. Workers wrapped cloth tightly around their heads. Skin burned beneath direct sunlight. Breathing itself sometimes felt difficult beneath the thick hot air. Children endured this same world beside adults. A small apprentice working in a pottery workshop wiped sweat from his face while carrying wet clay across crowded floors. Potters shaped vessels beside spinning wheels while fires roared nearby inside enormous kilns. The air smelled of smoke, earth, and heated dust. Clay dried quickly in the heat, forcing workers to move carefully and steadily. The child apprentice rarely rested. If he slowed too much, older workers shouted impatiently. Mistakes wasted precious material and time. Broken pottery meant lost income for the workshop owner. So the boy learned to keep moving even when his back ached. In another part of the city, a young girl sat inside a weaving room beside older women. Long strands of linen stretched across wooden frames. Fingers moved constantly through thread while sunlight entered through narrow windows high in the walls. Dust floated lazily through the beams of light. The work demanded patience more than strength. Hour after hour, the girls learned how to guide thread smoothly through the loom. Small mistakes ruined patterns. Tangled thread created frustration for everyone. Older women corrected them quietly but firmly. Outside the weaving rooms, life continued beneath the burning afternoon sky. Merchants called softly from shaded market stalls. Donkeys carried baskets filled with vegetables, fish, or jars of beer through crowded streets. Temple workers swept stone courtyards already hot enough to burn bare feet. Children moved through all of it. Some carried messages for scribes or merchants. Others sold small goods beside busy roads. Some worked directly inside wealthier homes as servants while still very young. Servant children often lived difficult, quiet lives. A young servant girl might spend her entire day carrying water, cleaning floors, preparing food, washing clothing, and caring for younger children belonging to the household owners. Her feet hardened from endless walking across stone surfaces. Her hands became rough from constant contact with water, soap mixtures, and rough cloth. She learned early how invisible servants were expected to become. To move silently. To listen carefully. To avoid mistakes. Yet even within these demanding lives, moments of stillness appeared unexpectedly. Sometimes during the hottest part of afternoon, work slowed slightly beneath the unbearable heat. Farmers rested briefly beneath palm shade beside canals. Workshop labor paused while workers drank water or weak beer. Children sat quietly against walls breathing slowly while sweat cooled on their skin. These small pauses mattered deeply. The ancient world could be exhausting beyond modern imagination. Most labor was physical. Few machines existed to ease the burden. Carrying, lifting, grinding, cutting, digging, hauling, rowing, weaving, building, nearly every task depended directly on the human body. Children's bodies adapted early because they had no other choice. Over time, muscles strengthened. Hands hardened. Feet became used to rough surfaces and long distances. Young workers learned how to conserve energy during the hottest hours. They learned how to recognize signs of illness or exhaustion in themselves and others. Illness lived close to everyday life. Dirty water sometimes carried sickness through villages. Infections spread quickly in crowded homes. Parasites from river water weakened many people slowly over years. Cuts from tools or stones could become dangerous without treatment. Children witnessed sickness constantly. A younger brother burning with fever. An exhausted mother too weak to rise from bed. An older worker coughing endlessly from dust inhaled during years inside stone workshops. Death was not hidden far away from children in ancient Egypt. It existed quietly beside daily life. Perhaps this too helped shorten childhood. The world demanded emotional endurance early. Grief arrived without warning. Responsibilities shifted quickly when family members became ill or died. A child might suddenly take over the duties of an older sibling. A young boy could find himself working full days beside adults after losing his father. A girl might become caretaker for younger brothers and sisters while her mother recovered from childbirth or illness. And still the Nile continued flowing steadily beside them all. The river gave life, but it also reminded people constantly of nature's power and unpredictability. Floods sometimes failed. Crocodiles attacked fishermen. Boats overturned during storms. Strong currents swept away careless swimmers. Children respected the river because they grew beside it from birth. A boy learning to fish might first practice in shallow water close to shore. His father showed him how to throw nets properly, how to untangle ropes patiently, how to recognize safe places along the riverbank. At night they repaired damaged nets beneath dim oil lamps while insects buzzed around the flame. The father rarely spoke about fear directly. Instead he taught caution through habit. Never stand too near deep water alone. Never ignore sudden movements in the reeds. Never waste supplies because replacing them takes time and labor. These lessons shaped children as deeply as any formal education. Meanwhile, children born into wealthier households lived somewhat different lives, though adulthood still arrived early for them as well. Inside larger homes decorated with painted walls and shaded courtyards, noble children often had servants attending to daily tasks. They wore finer linen. They ate better food. They avoided much of the brutal physical labor faced by farming families. But expectations remained heavy. Young boys from elite families studied writing, mathematics, religion, and administration for long hours each day. Their future roles inside government or temple systems required discipline from childhood onward. A scribe's education could be mentally exhausting. Inside schoolrooms, boys copied symbols endlessly onto writing boards while teachers walked slowly between rows correcting mistakes. Reed pens scratched across plaster surfaces in steady rhythm. Outside, sunlight burned white against temple walls while inside the air remained warm and still. The students' backs grew sore from sitting motionless. Their fingers cramped from repetition. Mistakes brought punishment. Ancient Egyptian education was not gentle. A well-known saying from ancient texts claimed that a boy's ears were on his back, meaning he listened when beaten. Discipline formed a central part of training for many children regardless of social class. Adulthood required obedience. At least that was what society expected. Girls from wealthier homes learned household management, religious customs, music, weaving, and preparation for marriage. Some noble girls enjoyed more comfort than ordinary laborers, but their futures were still largely decided early. Marriage often came during the teenage years. Motherhood followed soon after. The transition from child to adult woman could happen so quietly that the young girl herself barely understood when one life ended and another began. As evening slowly approached across Egypt, sunlight softened from blinding white into warm gold. Workers began returning home through dusty roads. Cattle moved slowly beside them. Boats drifted toward shore carrying fishermen exhausted from the day. Children walked home too. Their feet hurt. Their shoulders ached. Dust coated their skin. But evening carried its own kind of peace. Cooking fires appeared again one by one throughout the villages. The smell of baking bread drifted through narrow streets. Some families sat together outside their homes where cooler air finally moved through the darkness. The stars slowly returned above the Nile. Children listened sleepily while adults spoke in quiet voices about harvests, taxes, illnesses, marriages, repairs, and the endless practical concerns of survival. Younger siblings leaned against older brothers and sisters already half asleep. Nearby, insects hummed softly in the reeds. The river reflected moonlight again. And somewhere inside the tired mind of another Egyptian child, adulthood continued arriving little by little through exhaustion, repetition, responsibility, and the endless passing of ordinary days beside the ancient water. The seasons along the Nile did not change with sudden color or cold winds the way they did in distant northern lands. Instead, life in ancient Egypt moved according to the river itself. The flooding season arrived slowly, quietly covering the fields beneath dark water that shimmered beneath the sun. Then the waters pulled away again, leaving behind soft black soil rich enough to feed entire villages. Children learned this cycle before they understood numbers or years. The river decided everything. It decided when fathers planted grain. It decided when mothers stored food carefully inside clay jars. It decided when fishermen could travel safely and when boats remained tied to the shore. Even the smell of the air changed with the seasons of the Nile. During flood months, villages sometimes felt strangely quieter. The fields disappeared beneath water, and ordinary farming paused for a while. But this did not mean rest. For many workers, it meant different labor. Men were often called to large building projects during these months. Some traveled to construction sites where temples, tombs, and monuments slowly rose from stone beneath the authority of kings and officials. Others repaired canals, roads, storage buildings, or river docks damaged by earlier floods. Children watched these departures carefully. A young boy standing outside his home at dawn might see his father joining a long line of laborers moving slowly toward distant construction camps. Tools rested across their shoulders. Dust rose around their feet. The early sky glowed pale orange behind them while wives and children remained behind in silence. Sometimes older sons traveled too. Not fully grown men yet, but old enough to carry stone, water, tools, or supplies. A boy perhaps 12 or 13 years old could already spend long days beside adult workers beneath the open sky. Construction work in ancient Egypt demanded enormous physical endurance. Stone blocks scraped across wooden sleds over packed earth. Workers hauled rope together in slow coordinated movements while overseers shouted instructions. Sweat darkened linen clothing almost immediately after sunrise. Sand stuck to wet skin. The sound of hammering echoed endlessly against unfinished walls. Young workers learned quickly how painful labor could become. Hands blistered. Muscles cramped. Necks burned beneath the sun. Yet there were moments when the work became strangely quiet too. A child carrying water jars between groups of laborers might pause briefly to feel the wind moving across the desert edge beyond the construction site. Far from crowded villages, the desert carried its own silence. Heat shimmered over distant dunes. Birds circled lazily high above the stone cliffs. Then someone called his name, and the work continued again. For girls remaining in villages during flood seasons, life also shifted with changing routines. Some spent longer hours weaving linen indoors while fields remained underwater. Others helped repair homes damaged by moisture or mud. Mothers organized food carefully during these months because every household depended on stored grain lasting until harvest seasons returned. Inside homes, children learned how fragile comfort could be. A cracked storage jar might ruin precious grain if insects entered. A damaged roof could leak during unexpected rain. Illness spread more easily in damp, crowded rooms near standing water. And so responsibility settled heavily even on very young shoulders. A little girl carrying bundles of dried reeds for roof repairs might barely remember a time when adults did not expect useful work from her. She simply moved through the routines handed down around her. Her world was shaped by practical needs. Fetch water. Prepare grain. Watch younger children. Patch clothing. Carry wood. Sweep floors. Help. Always help. Yet ancient Egyptian children were not empty, quiet machines of labor. Beneath all the responsibility, they still carried imagination, curiosity, fear, jealousy, affection, and dreams just like children in every age. A boy helping his father repair fishing nets at night might stare across the river wondering what existed beyond the dark horizon. A young girl grinding grain beside older women might secretly listen to stories whispered about distant cities, royal palaces, or strange travelers arriving from foreign lands. Children absorbed stories constantly. Egyptian life was filled with religion, ritual, and myth woven naturally into ordinary routines. Gods watched over rivers, harvests, childbirth, storms, sickness, and death. Temples stood beside marketplaces and homes. Priests moved through cities in white linen garments carrying incense and sacred objects. Even ordinary workers lived close to the spiritual world. Children heard prayers spoken over meals. They watched offerings placed before household shrines. They listened to stories about Osiris, Isis, Horus, and Ra beside evening fires while darkness settled over the villages. The line between everyday life and sacred belief felt soft and natural. A child might wear a small protective amulet around the neck from infancy onward. Mothers whispered prayers over sleeping babies to guard them from sickness or harmful spirits during the night. Fathers thanked the gods quietly for successful harvests or safe river journeys. Religion brought comfort to difficult lives. It offered explanations for suffering, hope for protection, and promises of peace after death. Children grew inside these beliefs completely. Death itself was never hidden from them. Funeral processions moved openly through villages and cities. Families mourned publicly. Tombs were built carefully because Egyptians believed deeply in life continuing after the body ended. A child might stand silently beside adults watching workers carry a wrapped body toward burial grounds west of the Nile where the sun disappeared each evening. Priests chanted softly while incense drifted through the air. Relatives wept quietly beneath the heat. The child learned early that life was temporary. And perhaps because of this, adulthood arrived even faster. In many households, children were treated not as fragile innocent beings needing endless protection, but as future adults already preparing for survival. Parents certainly loved their children deeply. Ancient art and writings show tenderness between family members. Mothers held babies carefully. Fathers played games with sons and daughters. Families grieved intensely when children died. But love existed beside harsh necessity. A farming family struggling through poor harvests could not afford years of carefree youth. Work needed doing every single day. Food needed preparing. Water needed carrying. Animals needed feeding. Even the youngest children contributed however they could. Near larger cities like Thebes or Memphis, street life exposed children to even wider worlds. Markets crowded with merchants selling fish, vegetables, oils, sandals, pottery, and cloth stretched through narrow dusty roads. Donkeys pushed through crowds carrying baskets. Scribes sat beneath shaded awnings recording transactions. The smell of spices, sweat, smoke, and river mud blended heavily in the warm air. Children ran errands through these streets constantly. Some worked directly in market stalls beside parents. A young boy might spend all day calling softly to passing customers while arranging onions or dates carefully in woven baskets. A girl could help measure grain or wrap purchases in linen cloth. Market children learned adult behavior quickly. They observed bargaining, watched arguments over prices, learned how to recognize dishonest customers, learned how to speak respectfully to wealthier buyers while remaining cautious around strangers. By the time many reached adolescence, they already understood survival in practical detail. Meanwhile, children from poor rural families often knew little beyond their villages and nearby fields. Their worlds remained smaller physically, yet equally demanding. A farming boy might spend nearly every day following the same dusty routes between home, field, and river. He knew the exact feeling of mud between his toes during planting season. He knew where birds nested near irrigation canals. He knew how the air smelled before a sandstorm arrived. His education came directly from the land itself. At night, after exhausting labor, children sometimes sat quietly beside older relatives listening to memories of earlier years. Grandparents spoke slowly beneath starlight while oil lamps flickered against mud brick walls. They remembered larger floods, harder droughts, epidemics, times when grain stores failed, times when the river rose beautifully high and harvests became plentiful. History passed orally through these quiet conversations. Children learned not only practical survival but emotional endurance too. They learned that hardship always returned eventually. But they also learned that people continued living anyway. The rhythm of ordinary life carried them forward. Morning. Work. Eat. Evening. Sleep. Again and again beneath the endless Egyptian sky. Some children became apprentices in highly specialized crafts that shaped their entire futures. A stone carver's apprentice might begin by cleaning tools and carrying broken rock fragments before slowly learning how to shape softer stone surfaces with careful precision. Inside carving workshops, fine dust covered everything. Workers sat cross-legged for hours cutting delicate lines into statues, tomb walls, or temple decorations. The sound of chisels tapping stone created a strangely gentle rhythm inside the rooms. A young apprentice watched every movement carefully. Mistakes mattered greatly. One wrong strike could ruin days of labor. Over years, the boy's hands slowly learned the necessary control. Muscles strengthened. Eyes sharpened. Childhood faded almost unnoticed beneath discipline and repetition. Other children entered musical training for temples or noble households. Young singers and musicians practiced hymns and ceremonial performances for religious rituals. Their education demanded patience and obedience just like physical trades did. Even beauty became labor. Girls trained in dance or music for temple ceremonies spent long hours repeating movements until exhaustion settled into their limbs. Their childhoods, too, moved steadily toward adult expectations. Marriage remained one of the clearest signs that childhood had ended entirely. For girls especially, this transition could happen startlingly early. A young teenage girl might suddenly leave her family home to begin life as wife and future mother. Her days quickly filled with responsibilities once handled by older women around her. Preparing food. Managing supplies. Washing clothing. Caring for infants. Her own childhood disappeared quietly beneath domestic routine. Boys entered adulthood differently but no less abruptly. A young man expected to support a household needed steady work immediately. Farming, fishing, building, trade, military service, or skilled crafts became his identity. There was little time for uncertainty. The ancient world rarely allowed drifting between childhood and adulthood. One became useful quickly or suffered greatly. And still, through all of this, tenderness survived in small hidden ways. A tired mother smoothing dust from her child's hair before sleep. A father teaching his son how to tie fishing knots patiently beside the river. Older sisters carrying sleeping younger siblings home beneath moonlight. Grandparents telling stories softly while warm night air moved through open doorways. Human warmth endured beside hardship. Late at night, after villages finally quieted, the Nile continued flowing beneath the stars exactly as it had for thousands of years. Water moved softly against reeds and boats tied near shore. Insects hummed in darkness. Palm leaves rustled gently in the warm wind. Inside one small mud brick home, an exhausted child slept deeply after another day of work beneath the Egyptian sun. Small hands still carried traces of grain dust. Feet remained sore from stone roads. Muscles ached quietly beneath sleep. And somewhere between one ordinary sunrise and another, childhood continued fading gently into adulthood beside the ancient river that never stopped moving. In the deepest hours of night, when even the dogs had stopped barking and the last cooking fires faded into soft gray ash, the villages beside the Nile became almost completely still. Moonlight rested quietly on the flat roofs of mud brick homes. Palm trees swayed gently against the dark sky. Somewhere beyond the sleeping fields, water moved slowly through irrigation canals with a soft whispering sound that blended into the silence. Inside the homes, families slept closely together. The air remained warm even at night during much of the year. Children turned restlessly on woven mats while insects drifted lazily through the rooms. A baby stirred and whimpered softly before falling quiet again beneath the comforting hand of a tired mother half asleep herself. For a few brief hours, labor loosened its grip. But dawn always returned. Long before sunrise, the first sounds of movement appeared again across the settlements. A wooden door creaked open. Sandals scraped softly against packed earth. Someone coughed in the darkness. Thin smoke rose slowly into the cool early air as fires were lit once more. Children woke into the same rhythms day after day. There was comfort in routine, even when the routine was exhausting. Ancient Egyptian life moved with steady predictability most of the time. The river flooded. The crops grew. Grain was harvested. Bread was baked. Boats crossed the Nile. Families worked until their bodies became tired enough for sleep. A child understood life through these repeating patterns. One young boy living near the edge of a farming village woke each morning before his younger brothers. He had reached the age when his father expected more from him now. No one announced this change directly. It simply arrived through heavier tasks and fewer moments of rest. At first he only carried water. Then he guided goats toward grazing areas beside the canals. Now he walked beside the oxen during plowing season, using thin branches to guide the animals through wet soil while his father pressed seeds carefully into the earth behind them. The mud squished between his feet with each slow step. Birds followed close behind, searching for insects and scattered grain. The morning air smelled rich and damp before the full heat of the day arrived. Sometimes the boy still felt like a child. Especially during quiet moments when dragonflies hovered above the water or when he spotted fish moving beneath the surface of the canals. His attention drifted easily then. The world still carried wonder for him. But adulthood waited patiently inside the routine itself. If he stopped working too long, his father called sharply for him to focus again. There was always more work. In nearby villages, girls woke into their own growing responsibilities. A young girl who once played outside while older sisters prepared meals now found herself standing beside the cooking fire each morning, shaping bread dough with tired hands. The kitchen spaces inside Egyptian homes were often hot even before sunrise. Clay ovens trapped heat heavily inside small rooms. Smoke clung to the walls and ceiling. Sweat formed quickly across the skin while grain was ground into flour and dough pressed flat for baking. The girl's arms ached from grinding grain. The heavy stone grinder demanded slow, endless motion. Older women had strong shoulders from years of repetition. Younger girls struggled at first. But over time, their bodies adapted just as generations before them had done. Learning adulthood often meant learning endurance. Not only physical endurance, but quiet emotional endurance too. Children learned how to continue working while tired. How to remain respectful even when frustrated. How to carry responsibility without complaint because everyone around them carried burdens too. Ancient Egypt depended deeply on cooperation within families. A household could not function if members refused their duties. Food preparation alone required enormous daily effort. Grain had to be cleaned, ground, mixed, shaped, baked, and stored carefully. Water needed constant carrying from wells or riverbanks. Clothing had to be washed by hand in river water beneath the heat. Children became part of this system naturally. Even very small tasks mattered. A child gathering dry reeds for fuel helped cooking fires continue burning. A boy scaring birds away from grain fields protected precious food supplies. A girl rocking a baby sibling to sleep freed her mother's hands for other labor. Nothing was considered too small to matter. And because every task mattered, children grew into usefulness almost immediately. During the hottest months, midday could feel endless. Sunlight turned the pale walls of villages almost white beneath the glare. The air itself seemed to stand still above the fields. Workers wrapped linen tightly around their heads and shoulders while searching constantly for shade. Children suffered beneath this heat just as adults did. A boy carrying supplies across a construction site might feel dizziness rising inside him while hot wind blew sand against his face. A girl weaving linen inside a crowded room wiped sweat from her eyes while trying to keep thread from tangling beneath tired fingers. There were no easy seasons. Even nighttime sometimes brought little relief when hot air lingered inside the mud brick homes after sunset. And yet people continued. Human beings are remarkably skilled at adapting to difficult worlds. Children especially learned flexibility quickly because they had never known another kind of life. The routines that might appear harsh to distant future generations simply felt normal to them. Near the river, fishermen's children experienced another rhythm entirely. Their days often began earlier than most because fishing depended heavily on light, water conditions, and timing. Before dawn, boys followed fathers quietly toward the shore carrying folded nets over narrow shoulders. Boats rested against muddy banks beneath fading stars. Frogs croaked softly among reeds while cool mist hovered above the dark water. The Nile at dawn could feel peaceful beyond words. The world remained suspended between night and day. Oars dipped gently into still water. Fish occasionally disturbed the surface with quiet splashes. Far away, temple towers and palm trees appeared only as dark shapes against the growing light. For a little while, work and beauty existed together. The boys learned how to read the river carefully. Where currents moved strongest. Where fish gathered. Where crocodiles sometimes rested unseen beneath the surface. Fishing demanded patience more than speed. Nets had to be cast properly. Boats balanced carefully. Sudden movements frightened fish away or risked overturning the narrow vessels. A child learned calmness through repetition. He also learned fear quietly. Not dramatic fear, but practical caution carried every day beneath the surface of life. Ancient Egyptian children understood danger early because danger surrounded ordinary routines constantly. River animals. Disease. Heat exhaustion. Injuries from tools. Food shortages. Even wealthy households were not completely protected from suffering. Illness entered palaces and poor homes alike. Childbirth remained dangerous for women of every class. Infection cared little about social status. Children watched adults respond to hardship with steady acceptance more often than panic. This shaped them deeply. A boy seeing his father continue working through pain learned that endurance was expected. A girl watching older women care calmly for sick relatives learned that fear solved very little. Emotional control became part of adulthood too. In larger towns and cities, children encountered even more complicated social worlds. Streets near markets or temple districts remained crowded from morning until evening. Travelers arrived from distant regions carrying strange goods, languages, and stories. A merchant's son growing up in these places learned negotiation before he fully matured physically. He observed weights being measured carefully. Listened to arguments over prices. Watched how experienced traders smiled politely while protecting themselves from dishonest deals. Trade required intelligence as much as strength. Some children became surprisingly skilled at reading adults long before reaching adulthood themselves. They learned when customers were impatient. When officials expected gifts or favors. When workers were angry or exhausted. The ancient world demanded awareness. Children who paid attention survived more easily. Inside temple complexes, another kind of childhood unfolded. Temples in Egypt were not only religious centers but also places of education, storage, administration, and employment. Priests moved quietly through cool stone halls carrying incense while scribes copied records onto papyrus scrolls nearby. Young apprentices inside temple systems often lived highly disciplined lives. A novice scribe might spend entire days practicing symbols repeatedly while seated cross-legged beneath dim-filtered sunlight. The smell of ink and papyrus filled the rooms. Teachers corrected posture, pronunciation, and handwriting constantly. The child's world became narrow and focused. Precision mattered greatly in written work. Official records controlled taxes, harvest measurements, labor assignments, religious ceremonies, and trade agreements. Mistakes could create serious consequences. So childhood patience slowly transformed into adult discipline. Many boys feared harsh teachers more than physical labor itself. Still, families often considered this path desirable because scribes usually avoided the brutal body-breaking work faced by farmers and builders. Education offered a different kind of survival. Girls rarely received formal writing education except in wealthier or unusual circumstances. Most instead trained entirely within domestic life. Their mothers and grandmothers became their teachers. How to store grain safely. How to recognize spoiled food. How to soothe crying infants. How to mend linen. How to manage limited household supplies during difficult seasons. This knowledge was essential. Without skilled household management, families suffered quickly. And so girls often carried adult responsibilities long before adulthood fully settled emotionally inside them. One quiet evening beside the Nile, a young girl sat outside her family home holding her baby brother while her mother baked bread nearby. The sky glowed deep orange above the river. Palm leaves rustled softly in the evening wind. Somewhere farther down the village road, someone played a simple reed flute. For a few moments, the girl simply watched the light fading across the water. She was still young enough to drift into daydreams. But tomorrow morning she would rise before sunrise again. She would grind grain, carry water, wash cloth, help prepare meals. Her childhood already existed only in small scattered pieces hidden between responsibilities. This happened slowly across all of ancient Egypt. There was rarely one sudden ending. Instead, adulthood arrived through thousands of ordinary repetitions. Through sore muscles. Through expectations. Through silence. Through being needed. Children became adults because life required it from them. And beneath the stars, beside the endless flowing Nile, generation after generation crossed that invisible line almost without noticing where childhood had gone. The mornings during harvest season carried a different feeling across the Nile Valley. Even before sunrise, the villages seemed more alert, more awake. Workers moved quickly through narrow streets with tools balanced across their shoulders while the air still held traces of coolness from the night. In the distance, fields of ripened grain waited beneath the pale early sky, stretching outward in soft gold beside the dark fertile soil left by the river. Children felt the urgency too. Harvest season was one of the busiest times of the year. Entire families worked together because crops had to be gathered before birds, insects, weather, or spoilage destroyed the precious food supply. The success of the harvest shaped the months ahead. Full storage jars meant survival. Poor harvests meant worry carried quietly through every household. A young boy followed his parents toward the fields while dawn slowly brightened around them. His bare feet pressed against cool dirt paths still damp from the night air. Around him, other families walked silently in the same direction. Some carried woven baskets. Others carried sickles with curved blades that glinted softly in the growing light. No one spoke much at first. people saved their energy for the long hours waiting ahead. When the sun finally rose fully over the eastern horizon, golden light spilled across the grain fields. The stalks moved gently in the morning breeze like ripples on water. Birds circled overhead searching for scattered seeds while workers spread through the fields in long uneven lines. Then the cutting began. The sound was soft at first. Thousands of small slicing motions through dry stalks. Rustling grain falling into bundles. Sandals shifting through dirt and straw. Quiet voices calling instructions across the rows. Children worked among the adults. A younger child gathered loose stalks left behind after the cutting. Older boys carried tied bundles toward carts or storage areas. Girls helped organize grain piles while also bringing water to exhausted workers beneath the rising heat. By midday, sweat soaked everyone's clothing. The sun burned heavily above the open fields without mercy. Dust clung to skin and eyelashes. Hands became rough from dry straw and rope. Workers bent forward hour after hour until their backs throbbed with pain. Children learned physical exhaustion early during seasons like these. A boy who once struggled to carry small bundles now lifted far heavier loads than he thought possible. A girl who once only watched older women work now found herself standing beside them for entire days beneath the sun. No one paused childhood deliberately. Life simply continued pulling children forward into adult labor little by little. Yet harvest season also carried moments of quiet beauty hidden inside the exhaustion. In the late afternoon, when sunlight softened slightly and long shadows stretched across the fields, tired workers sometimes paused briefly to drink water beside irrigation canals. Children sat silently near the water's edge with aching legs while dragonflies hovered above the surface. The smell of cut grain filled the warm air. Somewhere nearby, cattle moved slowly through harvested fields eating leftover stalks. Birds settled across the ground searching for fallen seeds. The Nile shimmered calmly beyond the farmland as if unaware of the endless labor happening beside it. For a few moments, stillness returned. Then work resumed again. At night during harvest periods, villages remained active much later than usual. Grain needed sorting, counting, storing, and protecting from moisture or pests. Oil lamps flickered inside storage buildings while workers continued carrying heavy sacks long after sunset. Children stayed awake through much of this activity too. A young girl might sit half asleep beside her mother separating damaged grain from good grain by hand beneath dim light. Her fingers moved slowly through the piles while voices murmured softly around her. Nearby, older boys stacked storage jars carefully against mud brick walls. Dust floated through the warm air. The smell of grain became thick and dry inside the enclosed spaces. Eventually exhaustion overtook everyone. Families returned home through dark quiet streets beneath enormous stars. Muscles ached deeply after days of repetitive labor. Children often fell asleep almost immediately once they lay down, too tired even to finish conversations. Then morning returned again. The cycle continued. For farming families, children represented hope but also necessity. Large households often survived more easily because more hands could share the labor. This reality shaped family life throughout ancient Egypt. Mothers carried enormous responsibilities. Pregnancy, childbirth, food preparation, weaving, cleaning, childcare, water carrying, and household management filled nearly every hour of their lives. Young daughters learned these responsibilities by remaining constantly near older women from infancy onward. A little girl watched how babies were wrapped and soothed. How bread dough should feel beneath the fingers. How herbs were prepared for illness. How linen was washed properly in river water. Knowledge passed quietly between generations through observation more than direct instruction. Meanwhile, boys followed fathers, uncles, and older brothers into male labor spaces. They learned farming, fishing, building, animal care, trade, or craft work by watching carefully and repeating movements until the body remembered automatically. Ancient Egyptian childhood was deeply connected to imitation. Children became adults largely by standing close beside adults every day. In wealthier households, the process looked somewhat different but carried similar expectations underneath. Noble children often had servants attending to daily needs, yet their futures were still prepared early and seriously. A young son of an official might spend long afternoons practicing writing while servants brought water and food nearby. His hands remained softer than those of farming boys, but his education demanded mental endurance instead of physical strength. He memorized religious texts, copied administrative records, studied proper speech and behavior. His childhood also narrowed toward adulthood through constant preparation. For daughters of wealthy families, beauty and household skill often became important expectations. They learned music, dance, etiquette, weaving, and religious customs suitable for elite society. Marriage alliances between families carried social importance. Even comfort came with pressure. Across every level of society, children slowly transformed into future workers, spouses, parents, and caretakers. Very little existed in between. One quiet evening near Memphis, a merchant sat outside his home teaching his son basic counting methods using small stones arranged carefully in the dirt. The marketplace nearby had finally fallen silent after a long day of trade. Warm wind carried the distant smell of river water through the streets. The boy listened carefully while his father explained measurements used for grain and cloth transactions. Mistakes in counting could cost valuable goods or create arguments with customers. The lesson felt simple, but hidden inside it was the slow shaping of adult responsibility. Elsewhere, near a fishing village farther south, a young girl sat beside older women repairing torn linen clothing beneath moonlight. Their fingers moved steadily while conversations drifted softly through the night air. They spoke about marriages, flood levels, a neighbor's illness, the coming planting season. The girl listened quietly, absorbing the concerns of adulthood long before fully understanding them. This was often how childhood faded in ancient Egypt. Not suddenly, not cruelly, simply through constant closeness to adult life. Children witnessed everything: birth, illness, death, work, arguments, death, religious rituals, exhaustion, love, responsibility. Nothing was hidden very far away. And because life expectancy was uncertain, society encouraged maturity early. Parents could not assume endless time remained to prepare children slowly for the future. Skills needed to be learned quickly because survival itself depended on readiness. Some children lost parents young and stepped into adult roles immediately afterward. A teenage boy whose father died might suddenly become primary laborer for the household. A young girl whose mother became ill could inherit full responsibility for cooking and caring for younger siblings almost overnight. Ancient Egyptian communities certainly helped one another during hardship when possible. Extended families often lived close together. Neighbors shared labor during difficult seasons. But survival still depended heavily on personal contribution. Children understood this even if no one explained it directly. During festivals and religious celebrations, however, life softened slightly. Temples filled with music, incense, food offerings, and processions. Workers wore cleaner linen clothing. Families gathered together near public celebrations or river ceremonies. Children loved these moments. Not because adulthood disappeared entirely, but because routine loosened for a little while. A boy who spent most days carrying tools through dusty fields might suddenly watch dancers and musicians moving through decorated temple courtyards. A girl exhausted from endless household tasks might taste sweet cakes prepared specially for festival days. Color and sound briefly interrupted ordinary labor. Even the air seemed lighter during celebrations. Yet the return to daily life always came quickly. The morning after festivals, workers rose before dawn again. Bread ovens were relit. Animals fed. Fields tended. Nets repaired. Children returned to their roles beside the adults around them. One of the quietest but most important changes in ancient childhood happened inside the body itself. Over years of labor, children physically transformed into workers. Hands hardened. Shoulders widened. Posture changed. Feet toughened against rough roads and hot ground. A child's body adapted to labor long before modern ideas of adulthood would recognize them as grown. A farming boy of 14 might already possess the endurance of an adult worker after years in the fields. A young girl of the same age could manage an entire household's daily food preparation almost alone. The ancient world moved according to necessity more than age. Night slowly settled once again across the Nile Valley. Oil lamps flickered behind woven reed windows. Tired workers stretched aching muscles before sleep. The smell of baked bread and smoke lingered softly in the warm darkness. Children lay beside parents and siblings listening to distant dogs barking somewhere beyond the village edge. Outside, the river moved endlessly beneath the stars, calm and ancient and patient. And all across Egypt, countless children drifted quietly toward adulthood one ordinary day at a time, carried forward by labor, family, repetition, and the slow endless rhythm of life beside the Nile. During the hottest part of summer, the air above the Nile Valley sometimes felt almost too heavy to breathe. Heat gathered over the fields before noon and remained there long after sunset. Mud brick walls absorbed warmth throughout the day and slowly released it again during the night, turning small homes into ovens where sleep came restlessly. Children grew up inside this heat. From infancy onward, their bodies learned to endure the dry wind, the bright white sunlight, and the endless sweating that shaped daily life in ancient Egypt. A child walking barefoot through village streets knew exactly which patches of ground remained cool in morning shade and which stones would burn painfully by afternoon. The seasons taught survival quietly. A young boy working beside irrigation canals during summer learned how quickly thirst could weaken the body. Water jars became precious companions carried carefully from place to place. Workers drank slowly, never wasting more than necessary. His father taught him without many words. Do not wait until dizziness comes. Rest briefly in shade when possible. Watch the animals because they sense exhaustion before humans admit it. These lessons passed from one generation to another like invisible inheritance. Meanwhile, inside crowded weaving rooms or kitchens, girls learned different forms of endurance. Summer heat trapped itself inside enclosed spaces where ovens burned or looms filled entire walls. Sweat rolled down backs and arms while work continued hour after hour. A girl kneading bread dough beside a clay oven could feel heat pressing against her face from both the fire and the afternoon air together. Her hair stuck against her forehead. Fine flour dust clung to damp skin. Still she worked. Because everyone worked. In ancient Egypt, labor surrounded children so completely that it often became difficult to separate childhood from usefulness. A child was loved, protected when possible, and cared for deeply by family. But at the same time, that child was also expected to contribute. Responsibility arrived early because survival demanded it. Near the larger cities, where temple complexes and government buildings rose above crowded neighborhoods, Some children experienced more structured paths into adulthood. Sons of scribes or officials often followed carefully planned educational routines beginning at young ages. At sunrise, a scribe's son might walk through dusty streets carrying writing boards beneath his arm while servants swept the entrances of nearby temples. Merchants opened market stalls. Donkeys loaded with goods moved slowly between buildings. Inside school chambers attached to temples or administrative centers, the air remained cooler than outside. Thick stone walls protected the rooms from some of the heat. Light entered softly through high narrow openings while rows of students sat quietly on reed mats. The boys copied symbols again and again. Ink stained their fingers. Reed pens scratched steadily across plaster-coated boards. Teachers moved through the room correcting posture, pronunciation, and writing technique with strict attention. Some boys feared these instructors deeply. Ancient texts describe harsh discipline in schools, where mistakes were treated seriously because literacy carried enormous importance. A successful scribe might escape the physical destruction that years of farming or construction often caused. But the road toward that future was demanding too. Childhood still narrowed beneath expectation. For girls in wealthy households, education focused less on formal writing and more on preparation for domestic leadership. A noble girl learned how large households operated. She observed servants, storage systems, textile production, and religious customs expected of elite women. Her future responsibilities might include supervising many workers inside a large estate. So even comfort became preparation. Even luxury carried instruction hidden inside it. Meanwhile, far from elite homes, ordinary children often experienced the ancient world through their senses more than through formal teaching. They knew the smell of wet mud after the Nile flood waters retreated. The rough feeling of woven baskets against their palms. The sound of sandals scraping across stone streets before dawn. The taste of warm flat bread eaten beside canals after hours of labor. The quiet hum of insects rising from the reeds at night. These small details formed the texture of daily existence. A farming child likely understood weather, soil, and river behavior far better than abstract ideas written in temple schools. Knowledge came directly from repetition and observation. One afternoon, a boy stood beside his grandfather near the edge of a field watching dark clouds gather far away above the western desert. The old man studied the wind silently for a long moment before speaking softly about the coming change in weather. The boy listened carefully. Not because this was a formal lesson, but because understanding the land mattered for survival. The grandfather explained how certain winds carried sandstorms. How the animals behaved before sudden changes. How crops reacted differently depending on flood levels earlier in the year. This was education too. Ancient Egyptian childhood was filled with these quiet practical transmissions of knowledge. Skills moved between generations almost invisibly through daily closeness. Mothers taught daughters while grinding grain. Fathers taught sons while repairing tools. Grandparents taught everyone through memory. And because families lived closely together in small spaces, children absorbed adult concerns constantly. There was little separation between the worlds of children and grown people. A child heard conversations about debt, taxes, poor harvests, illnesses, and marriages while lying half asleep at night beside the family. They watched tired parents count stored grain carefully during difficult seasons. They noticed tension in the room when food supplies grew low. Adulthood became familiar long before adulthood arrived. Yet there were still moments when children escaped briefly into softer worlds. During cooler evenings, after work finally slowed, groups of children sometimes gathered near the riverbanks or village edges where adults relaxed nearby. Some played simple games using stones, sticks, or carved pieces of wood. Others chased each other through dusty paths while laughter drifted into the warm night air. These moments mattered. Even in difficult societies, children searched naturally for play and companionship. A boy exhausted from carrying water all morning could still laugh while splashing beside friends in shallow river water during sunset. A girl burdened with household chores might still sing softly with cousins while washing clothing at the riverbank. Childhood did not disappear completely. It survived in fragments between responsibilities. But those fragments often grew smaller with age. By adolescence, many young Egyptians already carried nearly full adult workloads. Boys developed the hardened muscles and stooped posture of laborers after years in fields, workshops, or boats. Girls became deeply skilled in cooking, weaving, childcare, and household management. Marriage approached quickly for many. A young girl nearing womanhood might suddenly become the subject of quiet family discussions about suitable husbands. Her future depended heavily on marriage because household partnerships formed the foundation of ordinary Egyptian society. Some marriages likely brought affection and stability. Others perhaps brought exhaustion and difficulty. But either way, childhood usually ended soon afterward. A married teenage girl could find herself caring for infants while still emotionally very young herself. Sleepless nights beside crying babies replaced whatever remained of carefree youth. For boys, marriage often meant even heavier labor because supporting a family required steady income or successful harvests. Young husbands worked long exhausting hours trying to establish households of their own. The cycle repeated endlessly across generations. Children became workers. Workers became parents. Parents raised new children into labor again. All beneath the same sun. All beside the same river. Along the Nile at dusk, fishermen often returned home slowly while the sky turned deep orange and purple behind the palm trees. Boats scraped gently against muddy banks. Nets heavy with river weeds and fish were dragged ashore by tired hands. Children helped unload the catch. Small fish flipped across wooden surfaces while water dripped onto the ground. The smell of river mud mixed with scales, wet rope, and smoke from nearby cooking fires. An older fisherman sat quietly nearby repairing torn sections of netting beneath fading light. Beside him, his young grandson attempted the same careful knots with clumsy fingers. The old man corrected him patiently. Not because the child needed perfection immediately, but because one day the nets would belong to him too. This awareness shaped much of ancient childhood. The future was rarely imagined as something distant and open-ended. Instead, most children grew toward lives already visible around them. The farmer's son expected fields. The potter's daughter expected clay and ovens. The fisherman's grandson expected river water and nets. Life followed familiar paths. Of course, there were exceptions. Some children entered priesthoods, military service, skilled trades, or government administration that carried them beyond their parents' exact roles. But for most ordinary people, adulthood meant continuation more than reinvention. And perhaps this created a strange kind of stability too. Children always knew what adulthood looked like because it surrounded them constantly. Late one evening, after another day of exhausting heat, a family sat quietly outside their home beside a narrow canal. The father rubbed soreness from his wrists after hours cutting reeds. The mother held a sleeping infant against her chest while older children leaned silently nearby, too tired for conversation. Above them, stars appeared slowly one by one. The Nile reflected pale moonlight beyond the fields. A soft wind moved through the reeds carrying the smell of water and distant earth. For a few peaceful moments, no one worked. No one hurried. The ancient world became quiet again. And somewhere inside that silence, another generation of children continued drifting steadily toward adulthood beneath the endless warm night of Egypt. When the Nile floodwaters finally began to withdraw each year, the land seemed to breathe again. Slowly, dark soil emerged beneath the retreating water, smooth and rich and ready for planting. Farmers walked carefully across the soft ground, testing the earth beneath their feet, while birds gathered in enormous numbers along the wet edges of the fields. Children followed closely behind the adults. For many of them, these moments marked the true beginning of another cycle of labor. Planting season demanded patience and precision. Seeds could not be wasted. Water channels needed careful management. Entire harvests depended on small daily decisions made beneath the changing sky. At dawn, villages emptied gradually as families moved toward the farmland carrying baskets filled with grain for planting. The air smelled fresh and damp after the flood season. Mud clung heavily to sandals. Frogs leaped between reeds beside the canals, while insects hovered above standing pools left behind by the river. A young boy walked beside his older brother carrying a basket almost too heavy for him. His shoulders strained beneath the weight, though he tried not to show discomfort. He wanted to appear older now. The older brother noticed anyway. Without speaking much, he quietly shifted part of the weight onto his own shoulders for a while as they continued walking together through the morning mist. Small kindnesses like this existed everywhere in ordinary Egyptian life. Families depended on one another too deeply for survival to ignore suffering completely. Exhaustion was shared. Hunger was shared. Responsibility was shared. Even children learned early how to care for others while carrying burdens themselves. Once planting began, the work moved steadily across the fields. Men guided plows pulled by oxen through the soft soil while others scattered seed behind them. Children helped cover the grain by dragging branches lightly across the earth or driving animals carefully through the fields so their hooves pressed the seeds deeper into the mud. The smell of wet soil filled the air. Sunlight slowly climbed higher above the valley. Voices drifted softly between workers spread across the land. The labor itself could appear almost peaceful from a distance. But inside the work, bodies strained constantly. Feet sank into mud. Shoulders burned from carrying baskets. Backs ached from bending hour after hour. Children experienced the same exhaustion alongside everyone else. A girl perhaps 10 years old might spend the entire morning carrying water jars to workers in the fields, moving carefully along narrow canal edges without spilling the precious water. The jars grew heavier each season as adults expected more from her. Nobody formally announced these growing expectations. The body itself became the measure of readiness. If a child could complete the task became theirs from then onward. In this way, childhood slowly dissolved into capability. During quieter moments between labor, children sometimes observed the natural world surrounding them with deep attention. Ancient Egyptian life remained closely tied to the rhythms of animals, weather, river behavior, and seasonal change. A boy resting briefly beside an irrigation canal watched white birds standing motionless in shallow water hunting fish. Nearby, dragonflies flashed blue and green beneath the sunlight. Palm trees bent gently in the breeze beyond the fields. These scenes settled quietly into memory. The ancient world was physically demanding, but it was also deeply sensory. Children grew up surrounded by textures, smells, sounds, and landscapes that shaped them emotionally long before they understood larger ideas about society or history. The rough weave of linen against skin. The cool touch of river water at dawn. The sting of blowing sand against the face. The smell of baking bread drifting through evening streets. The soft sound of reeds moving at night. These details became the background of life itself. As children matured, many began spending increasing amounts of time away from home working directly within adult environments. Apprenticeships became common paths into skilled labor. A potter's apprentice might leave home before sunrise each day to work inside crowded workshops near the city outskirts. There he mixed clay with water using bare feet, kneading the heavy material until it reached the correct texture for shaping. The workshop smelled of wet earth and smoke. Pottery wheels spun steadily throughout the day while experienced craftsmen shaped jars, bowls, and storage vessels with smooth practiced movements. Kilns burned nearby, sending waves of heat through the already warm air. The apprentice watched constantly. At first, he performed only simple labor: carrying water, cleaning tools, moving finished pottery carefully onto drying shelves. But slowly the craftsman allowed him to shape smaller pieces himself. His fingers learned pressure and balance through repetition. Mistakes collapsed easily. Wet clay folded inward or cracked unevenly beneath uncertain hands. The adults corrected him patiently some days, harshly on others. The workshop became both school and workplace together. Meanwhile, girls often entered adult domestic roles through similar gradual immersion. A teenage girl helping manage household tasks beside her mother learned dozens of practical skills invisible to outsiders but essential for survival. How much grain a family needed weekly. How long dried fish remained safe to eat. How to store oil without spoilage. How to recognize fever in a child before it became dangerous. How to stretch limited supplies during difficult months. Ancient households functioned through careful constant management. Women carried enormous knowledge inside ordinary daily routines. Girls absorbed this knowledge piece by piece while still very young. One evening inside a crowded village home, a mother quietly showed her daughter how to prepare a medicinal mixture from crushed herbs for a younger sibling with stomach pain. Oil lamps flickered softly against the walls while insects buzzed near the ceiling. The daughter watched every movement carefully. Not because the lesson felt unusual, but because one day someone else would depend on her knowledge too. In many ways, adulthood in ancient Egypt meant becoming dependable. Dependable in work. Dependable in family duties. Dependable during illness, flood, drought, or grief. Children were shaped steadily toward this expectation from the beginning of life. Even emotional expression often reflected this practical culture. Public grief certainly existed, especially during funerals and family tragedies. Egyptians mourned deeply and openly at times. But ordinary daily hardship was usually endured quietly because survival left little alternative. Children observed this emotional discipline constantly. A father returned home exhausted after days of hard labor yet still repaired broken tools by lamplight because tomorrow's work depended on them. A mother continued baking bread despite fever because younger children needed food. An older sister comforted frightened siblings during storms while hiding her own fear. These examples taught children how adults behaved long before formal adulthood arrived. And still, despite all the responsibility, ancient children continued finding small islands of imagination within ordinary life. Some crafted toys from scraps of wood, cloth, or clay. Others invented games beside canals using stones or carved figures. Stories remained especially important. At night, after labor ended, families sometimes gathered outside beneath cooler air while older relatives told stories carried across generations. Tales of gods traveling the heavens. Spirits guarding tombs. Clever animals tricking stronger enemies. Ancient kings remembered through fading legends. Children listened with wide tired eyes while stars covered the sky above them. These stories offered escape from exhaustion for a little while. Not complete escape, but enough. Near temple cities, religious festivals occasionally transformed entire communities for brief periods. Processions moved through streets carrying sacred statues while incense drifted heavily through the air. Musicians played drums and flutes. Priests in clean white linen performed rituals before crowds gathered beneath colorful banners. For children, festivals could feel almost magical compared to ordinary routines. A boy who usually spent days knee-deep in muddy fields might suddenly watch torchlight reflecting from temple walls at night while music echoed through crowded streets. A girl exhausted from endless weaving or grinding grain might taste sweet cakes reserved for celebration days. For a short time, adulthood loosened its hold slightly. But only slightly. Once festivals ended, the routines returned immediately. Before sunrise the next morning, workers rose again. Fields waited. Animals needed feeding. Bread ovens needed lighting. Children resumed their places beside adults almost without pause. The years passed quietly this way across the Nile Valley. One season blending into another. One responsibility replacing the last. Children changed slowly beneath the process. A boy once small enough to ride on his father's shoulders across flooded canals now carried heavy farming tools himself. A girl once rocked to sleep beside her mother now soothed younger siblings through the night while adults worked nearby. Transformation happened gradually enough that few people stopped to notice it fully. Ancient Egyptian society did not view adolescence as a long separate stage between childhood and adulthood. The transition often felt practical rather than emotional. Once a young person could work reliably, marry, manage tasks, or contribute meaningfully, adulthood had largely arrived. And life moved forward. Late one night, beside a narrow stretch of riverbank far from the noise of larger cities, a teenage boy sat alone repairing fishing nets beneath moonlight. The village behind him had already fallen asleep. Only the sound of insects and slow-moving water filled the darkness. His hands moved automatically now. The knots no longer required thought. Nearby rested the small wooden boat he had once been too young to enter alone. Tomorrow before dawn, he would push it into the river himself while his aging father remained home resting sore joints and tired muscles. The boy paused briefly and looked across the dark Nile shimmering beneath the stars. The warm wind moved gently through the reeds. Somewhere far away, another child was waking beside a cooking fire. Another young girl was carrying water through dusty streets. Another apprentice was sweeping workshop floors before sunrise. And all across ancient Egypt, childhood continued fading softly into labor, memory, responsibility, and the endless patient rhythm of the river. As the years passed beside the Nile, children often stopped noticing the exact moment when adults began speaking to them differently. The change arrived so slowly that it blended into ordinary life. A boy once sent to fetch small tools now joined conversations about crop planting and irrigation repairs. A girl once asked only to watch younger siblings suddenly found herself responsible for preparing entire meals alone while older women worked elsewhere. No ceremony marked these transitions for most ordinary families. The days simply continued. Morning after morning, season after season, children moved deeper into the world of adults until the distance between them almost disappeared. Along the narrow roads connecting villages to larger towns, young workers could often be seen traveling before sunrise. The eastern sky remained dark blue while the first birds stirred among the reeds beside the river. Dust clung to bare ankles as groups of laborers walked silently together carrying baskets, tools, fishing nets, or bundles of linen. Among them were many children. Some looked scarcely older than the younger siblings still sleeping back home. Yet their faces already carried the calm, tired expressions of working adults. One boy walked each morning from his village to a stone workshop near a temple construction site. The journey took nearly an hour along dry paths lined with palms and irrigation canals. By the time the sun rose fully, sweat already dampened his linen clothing. At the workshop, the sound began immediately. Hammering. Scraping. Stone striking stone in endless repetition. Fine white dust floated constantly through the air and settled over everything: tools, walls, hair, skin, lungs. Older workers wrapped cloth loosely across their mouths while carving blocks for statues, columns, and temple walls. The boy's task at first had been simple cleaning. Now he shaped smaller decorative pieces himself beneath the watchful eyes of the master craftsman. His fingers had grown strong and careful over the years. Small cuts and scars crossed his hands from sharp stone edges. He no longer noticed the pain most days. The workshop had become his world. Children throughout ancient Egypt entered adult environments this way, not suddenly, but through long slow immersion. The line between learning and working barely existed. To learn a trade meant performing it every day until skill settled naturally into the body. This was true for girls as well. In a riverside village farther south, a young teenage girl spent her afternoons weaving linen beside her mother and aunts inside a shaded room open to the warm breeze. Wooden looms filled most of the space. Threads stretched tightly across frames while sunlight filtered softly through reed screens. The room carried the dry smell of flax fibers and dust. The women worked steadily while speaking quietly together about household concerns, marriages, illnesses, harvest predictions, and neighbors. Babies slept nearby on blankets while younger children played briefly in the corners before eventually being drawn into chores themselves. The girl's hands moved with growing confidence now. Years earlier she tangled thread constantly and struggled to maintain even patterns. Older women corrected her patiently then. Now younger girls watched her in the same way. Without realizing it fully, she had crossed into adulthood enough to become an example for others. This happened quietly everywhere. Responsibility passed downward from tired hands to younger hands generation after generation. Ancient Egyptian society depended deeply on continuity. Most people expected children to inherit not only family traits but also family obligations, beliefs, routines, and social roles. Stability mattered more than individual freedom. A farming family needed reliable workers. A workshop needed apprentices. A household needed caretakers. Children grew toward these expectations naturally because alternatives were limited for most ordinary people. Yet within this structured world, human emotions remained complex and deeply personal. A boy might secretly dread taking over his father's difficult labor one day even while respecting him deeply. A girl approaching marriage might feel both pride and fear about leaving her childhood home. Ancient children likely carried many of the same quiet worries found across all generations of human history. Would there be enough food next year? Would illness strike the family again? Would marriage bring kindness or hardship? Would the river flood properly? These concerns lived constantly beneath ordinary life. One evening during a season of especially poor harvests, a family sat together inside a dim mud brick home counting grain stores carefully by lamplight. The father's face remained tense while he measured portions into storage jars. The mother spoke softly about stretching supplies through smaller meals. The older children listened silently nearby. No one directly explained the danger. They understood anyway. Children learned anxiety early in worlds where survival depended heavily on weather, health, and labor. Yet they also learned resilience because difficult seasons came and went repeatedly throughout life. The next flood might be better. The next harvest stronger. Hope remained practical rather than dramatic. Near the Nile itself, river life continued shaping childhood in powerful ways. The river was not simply scenery. It was transportation, food source, water supply, workplace, spiritual symbol, and constant presence. Children living beside it developed deep familiarity with water from an early age. A small boy learned how currents changed during different seasons. A young girl washing clothing beside the shore learned where crocodiles were sometimes seen. Fishermen's children recognized bird movements signaling schools of fish nearby. The river became almost like another family member, generous sometimes, dangerous at others, always present. At dawn, the Nile often looked silver beneath the first light. Mist drifted low across the surface while fishermen pushed narrow boats quietly away from shore. Oars dipped gently into still water. Palm trees reflected softly in the current. Children sitting in those boats beside parents or older siblings absorbed the rhythms of river life without needing formal instruction. How to balance weight carefully. How to untangle wet nets. How to move calmly during sudden river changes. The lessons entered the body through repetition. For many young Egyptians, physical skill became more important than abstract knowledge. Strong hands, endurance, awareness, patience, and discipline mattered daily in ways impossible to ignore. A child who could work effectively became valuable quickly. This reality shaped family relationships too. Parents certainly cared deeply for their children. Ancient Egyptian art often shows tenderness between mothers, fathers, and children. Toys, lullabies, affection, and grief all existed fully within these communities. But affection lived beside expectation. A beloved child was still expected to contribute. Love did not remove responsibility. In wealthier homes, expectations appeared differently but remained powerful. Elite children faced enormous pressure to preserve family status, maintain proper behavior, and fulfill social obligations. A noble boy studying under temple instructors might spend long exhausting hours memorizing formal speech, religious hymns, and administrative procedures. Mistakes embarrassed not only himself but also his family. A noble girl learned complex household management while preparing for socially important marriage arrangements. Even privilege demanded performance. The ancient world rarely offered long periods of carefree independence to anyone. As adolescence deepened into adulthood, physical appearance changed alongside responsibility. Young workers developed lean muscular bodies shaped by labor. Skin darkened beneath the sun. Hands roughened permanently from tools, rope, water, and stone. Children disappeared gradually inside these transformations. One afternoon, a mother watched her teenage son lifting heavy grain sacks beside older men during harvest storage. Sweat covered his arms and shoulders beneath the blazing heat. For a brief moment she seemed startled by how much he resembled his father now. Perhaps memories returned quietly then. The same boy once sleeping beside her on woven mats during cooler nights. The same small child chasing birds along canal banks. Now adulthood stood visibly inside his posture and movement. Time moved quickly beside the Nile. Especially in lives governed by repetition. For girls, the changes could feel even more sudden. Marriage often arrived while they still carried traces of childhood softness in their faces. One season they worked beside mothers and sisters inside familiar homes. Soon afterward they belonged to new households carrying adult responsibilities immediately. A young wife might wake before dawn preparing bread for her husband while still missing the comfort of sleeping beside younger siblings in her childhood home. The transition left little room for hesitation. Ancient society expected adaptation. And most adapted because they had seen others do the same throughout their entire lives. Still, moments of gentleness survived. An older brother carrying extra water so his younger sister could rest briefly beneath the heat. A grandmother humming softly while untangling a child's dusty hair at night. A father teaching his son to recognize constellations above the desert during quiet evenings beside the river. These small acts mattered deeply in difficult worlds. They reminded children that adulthood was not only labor and burden, but also care, memory, and belonging. Late one night, after the village had fallen silent, a warm wind drifted across the Nile carrying the smell of wet reeds and distant earth. Oil lamps flickered faintly inside the last waking homes. Somewhere a baby cried softly before settling again into sleep. Outside one small house, a young girl sat alone for a few moments beneath the stars after finishing the evening chores. Her hands still smelled faintly of bread dough and river water. From inside the house came the low sound of adults speaking quietly about tomorrow's work. She looked toward the dark river shining beneath moonlight. Tomorrow would begin before sunrise again. There would be grain to grind, water to carry, clothing to wash, meals to prepare. And without fully realizing when it had happened, she had already become part of the endless ancient rhythm that carried children slowly, gently, and almost invisibly into adulthood beside the timeless flowing Nile. The farther one traveled from the great cities of ancient Egypt, the quieter life often became. Small farming settlements rested close to the Nile like clusters of sun-baked clay shaped gently into the earth itself. Palm trees leaned over narrow canals. Mud brick homes stood shoulder to shoulder along dusty paths where goats wandered freely and children carried water jars beneath the heat. In places like these, life moved slowly but never easily. Every season brought work that could not be delayed. The fields demanded attention. The animals needed care. Roofs cracked beneath the sun and required constant repair. Water jars chipped and leaked. Grain spoiled if stored poorly. Illness arrived without warning. Children grew up surrounded by these practical realities from the very beginning. A little boy sitting beside his grandmother during evening meals might listen quietly while adults discussed flood levels, crop damage, or sickness spreading through a nearby village. No one pushed him away from such conversations. He was expected to hear and learn. One day those concerns would belong to him too. During the cooler months, when the air became slightly gentler and winds drifted down from the north, daily labor felt more bearable for a while. Workers still rose before dawn, but the mornings carried softness rather than immediate burning heat. Children often remembered these mornings fondly. Mist hovered lightly over the river. Birdsong echoed across the canals. The earth smelled fresh beneath sandals dampened by dew. A young girl walking to the riverbank with her mother during these early hours might feel peaceful despite the work ahead. Together they carried empty clay jars balanced carefully against their hips. The village behind them still slept beneath fading stars. The river shimmered silver blue in the half-light. Nearby, fishermen prepared their boats quietly while reeds rustled in the breeze. Someone far away coughed softly. A donkey shifted its weight beside a storage shed. The world had not fully awakened yet. These quiet moments before sunrise often became the calmest part of the day for many Egyptian children. Once the sun climbed higher, labor filled every hour with movement and expectation. At the riverbank, the girl knelt carefully beside her mother while filling the jars. Cool water touched her hands. Small ripples spread outward beneath the surface while fish darted through shadows near the shore. Her mother worked quickly and efficiently. Years of repetition had made every motion smooth and economical. The daughter tried to imitate those movements now without spilling water or losing balance while lifting the jars. No formal lesson was happening. And yet the child was learning everything. Ancient Egyptian childhood relied deeply on imitation. Knowledge passed most often through observation rather than explanation. Children watched adults constantly because their future depended on mastering the same tasks. A boy learning farming studied the exact way his father held tools, judged soil moisture, or tied rope around cattle harnesses. A girl learning weaving copied finger movements and thread tension from older women. The body became a living memory of previous generations. In larger towns, apprenticeships shaped many childhoods into highly disciplined routines. Workshops lined busy streets where noise filled the air from sunrise until evening. Bronze workers hammered metal beside open fires. Carpenters shaved wood beneath clouds of dust. Stonecutters crouched over statues while chips scattered across the floor. Children moved through these spaces carrying tools, water, fuel, or supplies. At first, many apprentices spoke very little. They listened, watched, stayed out of the way. A master craftsman rarely trusted a young apprentice immediately with important work. Skill had to be earned slowly through obedience, patience, and endurance. One boy apprenticed to a carpenter spent nearly a year doing little more than sweeping floors, carrying lumber, and sharpening tools. His back ached daily from lifting heavy wood beneath the heat. Sawdust filled his nose and throat. Sometimes he wondered if he would ever learn real craftsmanship. But one morning, almost casually, the master handed him a small piece of wood and showed him how to shape a simple joint properly. The lesson lasted only a few moments. Yet afterward the boy worked with greater care and pride because adulthood had opened slightly wider before him. This was often how ancient children measured growth. Not through birthdays. Not through celebrations. But through increased trust and responsibility. Girls experience similar transitions inside households. A young daughter might suddenly be allowed to manage bread baking alone for the first time while older women worked elsewhere. Another girl might begin supervising younger children during busy harvest periods. Each new responsibility quietly announced changing expectations. By adolescence, many children no longer thought of themselves as children at all. The demands of life had already reshaped their identities. Still, there were emotional moments hidden beneath these practical routines. A mother seeing her daughter prepare meals confidently for the family might feel both pride and sadness quietly mixing together. Childhood seemed to disappear gradually, almost invisibly, inside ordinary work. One evening, after a long harvest day, a father sat outside repairing a damaged basket while his teenage son returned from the fields carrying tools across tired shoulders. The fading sunlight turned the dust golden around him. For a brief moment the father studied the boy silently, noticing perhaps the stronger posture now, the roughened hands, the exhaustion carried calmly without complaint. The child he once carried beside the river had become another worker standing beside him. Ancient life offered little time to pause and reflect on such changes openly. Tomorrow's labor always waited. Yet human hearts still noticed. Across Egypt, countless parents watched childhood fade quietly from familiar faces while the years moved steadily onward beside the Nile. Illness often made these transitions happen even faster. When sickness entered a household, healthy children immediately took on additional burdens. A girl whose mother became weak with fever might suddenly manage cooking, cleaning, water carrying, and child care all at once. A boy whose father injured himself during labor could find entire farming responsibilities falling onto young shoulders overnight. The ancient world demanded flexibility because life remained uncertain. There were no guarantees of long healthy adulthood. People died young often enough that children understood mortality very early. Funeral processions moved openly through villages and city streets. Mourning songs drifted from homes after deaths. Tombs line the desert edges beyond settlements, always visible reminders of life's fragility. Yet Egyptians also believed deeply in continuity beyond death. Children grew up hearing stories of the afterlife beside stories of ordinary labor. They watched families place offerings before household shrines. They learned prayers asking the gods for protection, fertility, healing, and safe passage into the next world. Religion surrounded everyday life gently but constantly. A young boy helping clean a small family shrine might carefully arrange bread or flowers before carved images of protective gods while incense smoke drifted upward through the room. A girl frightened by illness in the household might hear her grandmother whisper prayers softly through the night beside sleeping children. These beliefs brought emotional comfort to difficult lives. They also connected generations together. Ancestors remained important within family memory. Children inherited not only labor roles but spiritual traditions as well. Along the Nile during flood season evenings, entire villages sometimes gathered outside after the worst heat faded from the air. Adults rested sore muscles while children sat nearby listening to stories or songs. The atmosphere could feel strangely peaceful then. Oil lamps flickered softly. The river reflected moonlight beyond the reeds. Warm wind moved through palm leaves overhead. For a little while, exhaustion became quieter. Some children likely wished these evenings could last forever. But morning always returned. And with morning came labor once more. As boys approached adulthood, many developed close bonds with fathers, older brothers, uncles, or fellow workers through shared physical labor. Long days in fields, boats, workshops, or construction sites created silent companionship built more through action than words. A father teaching his son how to guide oxen properly through flooded fields might speak very little during the lesson itself. But the closeness existed anyway. The same was true among women and girls. Shared household labor created deep emotional ties between mothers, daughters, sisters, and grandmothers. Hours spent grinding grain, weaving linen, washing clothing, or preparing food allowed stories, advice, worries, and family memories to pass naturally between generations. Work and love became intertwined. Perhaps this is why ancient Egyptian children could endure so much responsibility while still feeling connected to family and community. They rarely faced adulthood alone. Instead, they entered gradually into networks of shared labor that had existed for countless generations before them. Late one night, after the village had finally fallen silent, a teenage boy walked alone toward the river carrying a damaged fishing net needing repair before dawn. The air felt cooler now. Stars stretched endlessly above the dark water. He sat beside the shore working slowly by moonlight. Nearby, frogs croaked among reeds while the Nile moved softly against the muddy bank. His fingers tied knots automatically from years of practice. He no longer needed instruction. The motions belonged completely to him now. Across the river, small lamps glowed faintly from another distant village where other children or perhaps no longer children at all prepared for another day of work beneath the ancient Egyptian sky. And quietly, almost without anyone noticing, another generation continued crossing the invisible bridge between childhood and adulthood beside the endless patient river that carried time forward through every season of human life. There were nights in ancient Egypt when the desert wind arrived suddenly after sunset, sweeping fine sand through the villages and across the riverbanks in soft restless waves. Palm leaves rattled against one another in the darkness. Loose reeds shifted along rooftops. Small clouds of dust slipped through open doorways and settled quietly over sleeping mats, baskets, and cooking tools. Children often woke during these winds. A young girl lying beside her sisters might hear the sound moving across the village like distant whispering. She pulled a thin linen cloth closer around herself while her mother rose briefly to secure the wooden shutters more tightly against the blowing sand. Then the house became quiet again. Outside, the Nile continued flowing steadily beneath the moonlight as it always had. The river rarely hurried. Perhaps that was why life beside it developed such patient rhythms over centuries. Children born along its banks entered a world where daily routines repeated with remarkable consistency. Water still needed carrying no matter which king ruled Egypt. Grain still needed grinding. Nets still needed repairing. Bread still needed baking before dawn. Ordinary life remained constant. And inside that constancy, childhood slowly dissolved into adulthood generation after generation. One boy growing up near a temple town spent much of his early childhood watching older laborers carve enormous stone blocks beneath the heat. The men seemed impossibly strong to him then. Their arms moved steadily despite the weight of the tools and the endless dust coating their skin. When he was small, the workers barely noticed him. He fetched water sometimes or swept stone fragments from pathways, but he remained outside the true labor. Then one year things changed. An older apprentice injured his hand badly while working. Suddenly the boy was asked to help more directly. At first he carried only lighter tools and supplies between craftsmen. Soon afterward he learned how to smooth rough stone surfaces using abrasive sand and smaller shaping tools. The work exhausted him completely. At night his wrists burned with pain. Stone dust filled his nose and throat long after he returned home. Yet beneath the exhaustion lived something else too. Pride. Not childish pride. Something quieter. The feeling of being needed. Ancient Egyptian society often treated usefulness as one of the clearest signs of maturity. Children became adults partly through the simple fact that others began depending on them more seriously. A daughter able to manage cooking alone became essential to household survival. A son strong enough to plow fields or handle fishing boats became necessary labor. Responsibility itself transformed identity. One evening after finishing work, the stoneworker boy sat outside his family home while his mother rubbed oil into the cracks along his dry hands. The sky glowed deep red beyond the western desert where the sun had disappeared. Neither of them spoke much. They did not need to. The roughness of his hands already told the story. Across the Nile Valley, similar moments unfolded quietly inside countless homes. Parents recognized adulthood arriving in children long before formal marriages or family titles appeared. Sometimes the signs were physical. A stronger posture. A deeper voice. The ability to carry heavier loads without complaint. Other times the changes revealed themselves emotionally. A young girl comforting frightened younger siblings during illness while adults worked elsewhere. A teenage boy calculating grain supplies carefully during a difficult season. A child beginning to worry about the household rather than only themselves. These quiet shifts mattered deeply. In wealthy households, childhood occasionally lasted slightly longer in outward appearance, but adult expectations still waited close beneath the surface. Noble sons trained for administrative or religious duties with relentless discipline. Noble daughters prepared for marriages carrying political and economic importance. Servants surrounded elite children, yet freedom remained limited. A wealthy boy studying beneath temple instructors might spend endless hours memorizing legal formulas, religious hymns, and writing techniques while scribes corrected mistakes sharply. His clothing was finer than a farming child's. His meals more abundant. But his future already belonged largely to family expectation. A noble girl learning music and ceremony within large household courtyards understood that one day she would manage servants, organize rituals, oversee food stores, and represent her family publicly. Even comfort carried responsibility. Meanwhile, ordinary children experienced adulthood through physical labor far more directly. Near the riverbanks, fishermen's sons often developed astonishing endurance while still very young. Hours spent rowing against currents strengthened shoulders and backs early. Handling wet nets demanded coordination and patience. River work could become dangerous quickly if attention drifted. A father teaching his son to navigate shallow channels at night beneath moonlight might speak softly while pointing toward hidden sandbanks or dangerous currents invisible in darkness. The boy listened carefully. Mistakes on the river sometimes meant death. Ancient children understood danger in practical ways modern childhood often shields away. Crocodiles lived near the reeds. Boats overturned. Disease spread from stagnant water. Construction accidents crushed workers beneath stone or timber. Yet life continued beside these dangers without constant panic. People adapted emotionally because they had no alternative. Children learned calm caution from the adults around them. Fear existed, but work continued anyway. One long afternoon during harvest season, a teenage girl stood beside other women separating grain beneath the burning sun while younger children played briefly nearby among empty baskets. Sweat darkened her linen clothing. Fine dust covered her arms. An older woman beside her suddenly became dizzy from the heat and nearly collapsed. Without hesitation, the girl moved immediately to support her, called for water, and helped guide the woman toward shade beneath a nearby palm. The reaction felt automatic. She had seen adults care for one another this way throughout her entire life. Adulthood often revealed itself not only through strength, but through the instinct to protect and assist others during hardship. Children learned this through endless observation. Inside workshops, homes, temples, and fields, they watched communities surviving together through cooperation more than independence. Even small villages required constant mutual effort. Irrigation canals needed maintenance. Flood damage required repair. Harvest labor demanded many hands working together. When families struggled, neighbors sometimes shared grain or labor if able. No household existed completely alone beside the Nile. The environment itself encouraged interdependence. Summer heat remained one of the great shaping forces of Egyptian life. During the hottest weeks, labor slowed slightly during midday when sunlight became almost unbearable. Workers rested briefly in whatever shade they could find. Children rested too. A young apprentice might sit silently against a mud brick wall breathing slowly while sweat cooled across dusty skin. Nearby, older craftsmen drank water carefully from clay jars before returning to work. These moments of stillness could feel strangely peaceful despite the exhaustion. The buzzing insects. The distant sound of river birds. Warm wind drifting through palm branches. Ancient childhood contains suffering certainly, but also countless small sensory moments woven quietly into memory. The coolness of wet clay against the hands. Fresh bread eaten beside canals after long labor. Stars reflected in river water during silent boat rides. The smell of lotus flowers drifting across the Nile at dusk. Perhaps these moments helped soften the burdens carried so early. At night, after villages settled into darkness, children sometimes listened half asleep while adults spoke quietly nearby about taxes, temple offerings, flood predictions, marriages, illnesses, or rumors traveling from distant cities. The children absorbed more than adults realized. They learned how the world functioned long before participating fully inside it. A boy hearing worried conversations about weak floodwaters understood instinctively that poor harvests might follow. A girl listening to women discuss childbirth dangers learned early that adulthood carried risks beyond simple labor. Nothing remained hidden for very long in tightly connected communities. This closeness to reality shaped maturity differently than modern protected childhoods. Ancient Egyptian children entered adult awareness gradually through direct exposure to ordinary life itself. One evening, after a day repairing irrigation walls damaged by floodwaters, a father and son walked home slowly beside the canal under fading orange light. Mud covered their legs nearly to the knees. Both carried tools across tired shoulders. The son had worked beside the men all day without being asked to stop or rest separately anymore. As they approached the village, other workers greeted the boy differently now. Not as a child helping temporarily, but as another laborer returning home. The change felt almost invisible, yet deeply important. Across ancient Egypt, thousands of similar moments unfolded quietly every season. Childhood faded not through sudden endings but through gradual acceptance into the exhausting, necessary, endlessly repeating work of survival beside the Nile. Late that night, long after the village fires had burned low, the river moved silently beneath enormous stars. Warm wind brushed gently through the reeds. Somewhere nearby, a baby stirred in sleep while exhausted parents rested beside older children already carrying the first heavy traces of adult life inside their tired hands and growing hearts. In the ancient Egyptian world, time often felt circular rather than forward-moving. The same floodwaters returned each year. The same stars crossed the night sky above the Nile. The same dusty roads connected villages where generations of families lived and died in nearly identical rhythms. Children sensed this repetition deeply, even before they could fully understand it. A young boy following his grandfather into the fields one morning might walk the exact same paths his father had walked years earlier, and his father before that. The irrigation canals curved through the land in familiar patterns. Palm trees cast the same shadows across the soil. Even the smell of wet earth after the floods remained unchanged through countless seasons. Life repeated itself softly beside the river. And childhood disappeared inside those repetitions so naturally that few people stopped to question it. During planting season, the villages awoke especially early. Before dawn, faint movement already stirred behind mud brick walls. Women relit cooking fires while smoke curled upward into the dark sky. Men checked tools by lamplight. Donkeys shifted restlessly beside storage sheds. Children rose with everyone else. There was no separate world waiting for them after sunrise. A farming girl, perhaps 11 years old, stepped quietly outside carrying a basket of seed grain against her hip. The air still felt cool enough to raise goosebumps along her arms. Somewhere nearby, frogs croaked from the canals while birds called faintly through the reeds. Her mother walked ahead carrying larger baskets with practiced ease. The daughter tried to match her pace. They moved silently toward the fields while dawn slowly spread pale gold across the eastern horizon. These shared walks became part of childhood memory for many Egyptian children. Long quiet journeys beside family members before the heat arrived. Sandals brushing through dust. The smell of river water drifting across farmland. Often very few words were spoken. But closeness existed anyway. Ancient families spent enormous amounts of time together simply because labor required cooperation. Parents and children worked side by side daily. Skills, habits, and emotional attitudes passed naturally between generations through constant proximity. A child learned patience partly by watching patient adults. Or learned endurance from exhausted adults who continued working despite pain. One afternoon near a canal outside Thebes, a teenage boy stood waist-deep in muddy water helping repair a damaged irrigation wall. Older men worked beside him pressing wet earth into place while the current pushed steadily against their legs. The labor was slow and tiring. Mud sucked at their feet with every movement. Insects gathered around the water. Sweat mixed with river mud across their skin beneath the blazing sun. Years earlier, the boy would have remained safely on shore watching the adults work. Now nobody questioned his presence there. His body had grown strong enough for the task. In ancient Egypt, physical capability often mattered more than numerical age. Once a child could contribute meaningfully, society gradually treated them as part of the adult world. This shift happened differently for boys and girls, but it came for nearly everyone eventually. Girls often experienced adulthood first through domestic responsibility. A daughter who successfully managed cooking fires, grain preparation, weaving, and younger children became increasingly central to household survival. One evening inside a crowded village home, a mother remained away helping a sick relative nearby. Without instruction, her teenage daughter quietly prepared the family meal alone. She measured grain carefully, managed the oven fire, watched younger siblings while bread baked. By the time the adults returned after dark, the household already functioned smoothly. No celebration followed. No one formally declared her grown. But afterward, more responsibilities naturally became hers. This was how childhood often ended in ancient Egypt. Not dramatically. Simply through competence. Boys, meanwhile, moved gradually into heavier labor spaces. Fields, boats, workshops, and construction sites became their classrooms. Many developed close silent bonds with older male workers through shared exhaustion. A boy apprenticed to a boat builder learned not only carpentry but also emotional discipline. The workshop owner expected calm concentration even during difficult tasks. Anger wasted energy. Carelessness wasted materials. The apprentice slowly absorbed these values through daily repetition. One morning he accidentally split an expensive wooden plank while shaping it. Fear tightened his stomach immediately. Good wood was precious along the Nile, where large trees remained limited. The master craftsman studied the damaged plank quietly. Then, instead of shouting, he simply handed the boy another tool and showed him how to avoid the mistake next time. The lesson stayed with the boy for years afterward. Ancient adulthood depended heavily on practical learning. Most children did not study philosophy or abstract theory. They learned through hands, muscles, observation, memory, and correction. Even emotions were taught indirectly through routine behavior. How to remain calm during hardship. How to continue working while tired. How to care for family members during illness. How to accept uncertainty without panic. Children watched adults navigate difficult lives every single day. And slowly, they learned to do the same. The Nile itself remained one of the greatest teachers. Its cycles governed agriculture, transportation, religion, and survival across Egypt. Children raised beside it developed instinctive awareness of its moods and dangers. A young fisherman's son could often recognize changing currents by sight alone. A girl washing clothing near the river understood where the bank became unstable after flooding. The river rewarded attention and punished carelessness. At dawn, the Nile often appeared almost dreamlike beneath the early mist. Boats drifted silently through pale silver water while distant temple towers glowed softly in the first sunlight. For a child sitting quietly inside one of those fishing boats beside a parent or older sibling, the world might feel peaceful despite the hardships surrounding daily life. Water lapped gently against wood. Birds schemed low across the surface. Cool air touched tired skin before the heat returned. These moments of calm became precious partly because labor consumed so much of ordinary existence. Children treasured small pauses naturally. A shared meal beneath shade during midday heat. Stories told beside cooking fires after dark. Brief games played near the riverbank before chores resumed. Fragments of childhood survived inside these quieter spaces even as adult responsibilities grew heavier. In larger cities, however, childhood sometimes disappeared faster beneath constant activity. Urban streets remained crowded and noisy from sunrise until late evening. Merchants argued over prices. Animals moved through narrow roads carrying goods. Temple workers swept enormous courtyards beneath the heat. Children working in cities learned alertness early. A market boy selling vegetables beside busy streets needed quick awareness to avoid theft or dishonest customers. A servant girl inside wealthy households learned how to move silently, obey instructions immediately, and anticipate needs before being asked. City children often matured quickly because crowded environments exposed them to adult complexity constantly. Money, power, religion, conflict, trade, social hierarchy. Nothing remained distant for long. One servant boy working inside a noble household spent entire days carrying messages between administrators, priests, and merchants. Though still young, he overheard conversations about taxes, political tensions, trade shipments, and temple affairs. He understood little at first. But over years the adult world slowly unfolded around him through observation alone. Ancient Egyptian children absorbed enormous amounts simply by remaining physically close to working adults. Even grief became familiar early. Illness continued shaping family life unpredictably. Children saw neighbors weaken from fever, infection, or exhaustion. Funeral rituals remained visible parts of community life. Tombs stood near villages and cities as constant reminders of mortality. Yet Egyptians approached death with a kind of calm continuity shaped by religious belief. The dead remained connected to the living through memory, ritual, and offerings. Children grew up accepting death as part of existence rather than something hidden away. A young girl helping prepare food offerings for deceased relatives might ask quiet questions about the afterlife while older women arranged bread, flowers, and incense before household shrines. The answers came gently through stories and tradition. Life continued after death. Families remained connected. The gods watched over both worlds. These beliefs softened fear somewhat within difficult lives. Late one summer evening, after unbearable daytime heat finally faded, villagers gathered beside the Nile where cooler air moved across the water. Adults rested aching muscles while children sat nearby listening to conversation drift softly through the darkness. Someone played a reed flute in the distance. The music carried slowly over the river. A teenage boy leaned back against a fishing basket, staring upward at the stars while his father spoke quietly with other workers about flood predictions for the coming season. The boy barely noticed anymore that adults included him in these conversations naturally now. No one told him childhood had ended. It had simply faded away somewhere between the fields, the workshops, the riverbanks, and the endless ordinary labor of ancient Egyptian life. And beneath the warm night sky, beside the patient flowing Nile, another generation continued stepping silently into adulthood, one exhausted sunrise at a time. By the time many Egyptian children reached their early teenage years, their daily lives already resembled the lives they would continue living as adults. The routines changed very little after that. The same work returned each morning. The same paths led toward the river, the fields, the workshops, and the marketplaces. Childhood did not end with a single moment. It slowly thinned away like mist above the Nile after sunrise. One young boy living near the southern stretches of the river had spent years following his father onto the water before dawn. At first he only sat quietly near the front of the boat wrapped in linen against the cool morning air while the older men cast nets into the dark current. Later he learned to untangle rope, then to row. then to pull heavy nets from the water without losing balance when fish struggled violently inside them. Now, at perhaps 14 years old, he sometimes guided the boat alone through familiar channels while his father watched silently from the stern. The river no longer felt enormous and mysterious to him. It felt like work. But somewhere beneath that work, the beauty still remained. The first light spreading across calm water. Birds lifting suddenly from the reeds. Mist drifting low above the riverbanks. The smell of wet mud and fish and morning air. These quiet details stayed with children even as labor hardened them. Ancient Egyptian life was exhausting, yet deeply connected to the natural world in ways modern life rarely allows. Children grew up beneath open skies. They watched seasons change through floodwaters and harvests. They understood heat, wind, soil, darkness, and water through direct daily experience. A farming girl walking barefoot through newly flooded fields understood the land physically. Mud pressed between her toes. Warm wind moved through her clothing. Insects gathered above the water. The earth itself became part of memory. During difficult seasons, however, nature could also become frightening. If the Nile flood arrived too weakly, anxiety spread quietly through entire communities. Poor floods meant weak harvests. Weak harvests meant hunger waiting somewhere ahead. Children sensed this tension quickly. One year, after unusually low floodwaters, a father sat late into the evening measuring grain stores by oil lamp while his children watched silently nearby. The room smelled faintly of dust, smoke, and dried grain. The younger children did not fully understand the numbers. But the older ones understood enough. Meals would become smaller. Nothing could be wasted. Work would grow harder. Ancient childhood often included this early awareness of uncertainty. Survival depended heavily on forces beyond human control: weather, illness, river conditions, insects, political demands from officials, even accidents during labor. And yet people continued building lives beside the Nile generation after generation. Perhaps because the river also offered continuity. No matter how difficult one season became, the sun still rose across the water each morning. Farmers still planted. Bakers still kneaded bread. Fishermen still pushed boats into the current before dawn. Children found stability inside repetition. One afternoon inside a weaving house near Memphis, several women worked together beside tall wooden looms while younger girls prepared thread nearby. Sunlight entered softly through reed screens, turning dust particles golden in the warm air. The room remained quiet except for the gentle sounds of weaving. Thread pulling tight. Wood shifting softly. Voices murmuring now and then. One teenage girl worked with deep concentration while an older woman beside her occasionally corrected small mistakes in the pattern. Years earlier, the girl had struggled even to keep thread from tangling. Now her hands moved almost automatically. The younger girls watched her carefully. Without fully realizing it, she had become part of the chain of adulthood herself. Children were beginning to learn from her in the same way she once learned from others. This gradual passing of knowledge shaped nearly every part of ancient Egyptian society. Skills survived because adults worked directly beside children every day. A stoneworker's son learned stone. A baker's daughter learned bread. A fisherman's child learned river currents. Knowledge moved through families like water flowing quietly through canals. Some children surely dreamed privately about different lives. Human imagination exists in every age. A farming boy might stare at passing merchant boats and wonder about distant cities beyond the horizon. A servant girl inside a wealthy household might secretly envy noble clothing or quiet shaded courtyards. But opportunities to change one's place in society remained limited for most people. Life usually followed inherited patterns. This reality shaped how children understood adulthood. The future rarely appeared wide open or uncertain. Instead, it waited clearly ahead, already visible inside the lives of older relatives. A boy could look at his father's rough hands and understand something about his own future. A girl watching exhausted mothers soothe crying infants after long days of labor could imagine adulthood approaching toward her too. And still, despite the burdens waiting ahead, family affection remained deeply important. Ancient Egyptian art often shows parents holding children tenderly or sitting closely beside them. Toys have been discovered buried in tombs beside children who died young. Small dolls, carved animals, gaming pieces, and miniature boats reveal that children were loved as children, even within demanding lives. One evening after work, a father sat outside his home carving a small wooden toy bird for his youngest daughter while the older children prepared fishing equipment nearby for morning labor. The father's hands were cracked from years on the river. His shoulders ached constantly now. But the small bird took shape carefully beneath his knife anyway. Children lived close to labor, illness, and death. Yet they also lived close to tenderness. This balance gave ancient family life much of its emotional depth. Grandparents especially played important roles within many households. Older relatives often helped care for younger children while passing along stories, beliefs, and practical wisdom gathered across decades. A grandmother sitting beside cooking fires during evening hours might tell children about floods from long ago, difficult famines survived by the village, or strange travelers once seen passing along the Nile. The children listened while warm bread baked nearby and darkness settled softly outside. These stories connected generations together. They reminded children that hardship was temporary, seasons changed, and life continued moving forward despite suffering. Ancient Egypt itself lasted for thousands of years partly because ordinary families maintained these rhythms so steadily across time. Even religion reinforced continuity. Children grew up surrounded by rituals honoring ancestors, gods, harvests, birth, and death. Temples dominated many towns physically and emotionally. Priests organized ceremonies believed necessary to preserve balance between humanity and the divine world. Children participated naturally in these practices. A young boy helping carry offerings into a temple courtyard inhaled the heavy scent of incense while chants echoed from stone walls. A girl assisting her mother during household prayers learned sacred words through repetition long before fully understanding them. The spiritual world existed close beside daily labor. Gods protected fields, guarded childbirth, watched the river, guided the dead. Ancient children rarely separated practical life from spiritual belief. Both flowed together through ordinary routines. As adolescence deepened, marriages began reshaping lives completely. For girls especially, marriage often marked the final quiet disappearance of childhood. A teenage bride entered new responsibilities almost immediately after leaving her family home. Cooking, cleaning, managing supplies, caring for future children, supporting a husband's labor. Some young wives probably felt proud stepping into adulthood. Others likely felt frightened beneath their calm expressions. Perhaps many felt both at once. Boys entering marriage also faced enormous pressure. Providing food and stability for a household required constant labor in a world already physically exhausting. A newly married young farmer might suddenly realize how completely adult responsibility had settled onto his shoulders. There was no long transition period. Only work waiting at dawn. Late one night, after the village had finally grown quiet, a young married woman sat outside her small home holding a sleeping infant beneath the stars. The air smelled faintly of river water and cooling earth after the heat of the day. Inside the house, her husband slept deeply after hours in the fields. The woman herself still looked almost like a child in some ways. But her hands moved with the careful patience of motherhood already. Nearby, frogs croaked softly among the reeds while the Nile shimmered pale beneath moonlight. Another generation had entered adulthood. And somewhere not far away, younger children still slept beside their parents, unaware how quickly the same ancient rhythm would carry them forward too, one quiet sunrise after another beside the endless flowing river. There were moments in ancient Egypt when the land itself seemed almost completely still. In the quiet hours just before dawn, before workers stepped onto the roads and before cooking fires filled the air with smoke, the Nile Valley rested beneath a soft blue darkness that made the world feel suspended between night and morning. Children sometimes woke during these hours without meaning to. A young boy sleeping beside his brothers might open his eyes and hear only the faint sound of river water somewhere beyond the village walls. The air felt cooler then. Palm leaves shifted gently outside. A distant dog barked once and then fell silent again. For a few moments, life held no demands. No baskets to carry. No tools to clean. No grain to grind. Only darkness and quiet breathing around him. But soon enough, movement returned. His mother rose first, as mothers often did. She moved carefully through the dim room preparing the cooking fire while trying not to wake the younger children too suddenly. Sparks glowed softly beneath the clay oven. The smell of smoke slowly filled the house. One by one, the family stirred awake. And another day of labor began. Ancient Egyptian childhood unfolded inside these endless cycles of waking, working, resting, and waking again. The repetition shaped people deeply. By adolescence, many children no longer needed instructions for ordinary tasks because routine had settled completely into their bodies. A girl could knead bread dough almost half asleep after years beside the oven. A boy could tie fishing knots in darkness without looking directly at his hands. Skill became instinct through constant practice. In villages along the Nile, mornings often carried a sense of shared movement. Entire communities seemed to awaken together. Workers stepped into dusty roads carrying tools over their shoulders while donkeys brayed impatiently nearby. Children moved among them naturally. A teenage boy walked beside older men toward the fields with a wooden plow balanced against his back. Though younger than the others, he matched their pace easily now. The muscles along his arms and shoulders had grown strong from years of labor. No one thought of him as merely helping anymore. He belonged to the work fully. Meanwhile, nearby, girls carried water jars toward the riverbank while speaking softly together beneath the growing light. Their laughter sometimes drifted briefly through the cool morning air before the heavier work of the day settled over them again. These small moments of companionship mattered. Ancient life could be physically exhausting and emotionally heavy, but human closeness softened the burden somewhat. Children rarely faced labor entirely alone. Friends, siblings, cousins, and neighbors worked beside one another constantly. A young apprentice sweeping a workshop floor might exchange tired smiles with another apprentice across the room. Girls washing linen beside the river shared stories quietly while their hands moved through the water. Older children helped younger ones complete difficult chores. Community surrounded daily survival. One afternoon during the hottest part of summer, several boys worked beside an irrigation canal clearing thick mud that blocked the water flow toward nearby fields. The sun pressed heavily against their backs while insects buzzed endlessly around the stagnant water. Sweat stung their eyes. Mud coated their legs. The labor seemed endless. Eventually one smaller boy slowed from exhaustion and sat down heavily beside the canal wall breathing hard. Without mocking him, an older teenager quietly handed over his own water jar and continued working. Such gestures appeared constantly in ordinary Egyptian life. People understood exhaustion because everyone experienced it. Children learned empathy not through lessons, but through shared hardship. The ancient world demanded endurance from nearly everyone, regardless of wealth or status. Even noble families worried about illness, political change, childbirth dangers, or failed harvests affecting their estates. Yet ordinary workers carried the heaviest physical burdens by far. Construction labor especially shaped many young lives. Near large temple complexes and royal projects, children often entered harsh work environments early. Boys apprenticed to stone workers, carpenters, painters, or labor crews spent years surrounded by noise, dust, and relentless physical effort. A teenage apprentice helping transport limestone blocks under the blazing sun could feel every muscle trembling by midday. Thick ropes burned against his palms while supervisors shouted instructions across crowded work sites. The air smelled of sweat, stone dust, and hot sand. And still the great temples rose slowly higher year after year. Children participated in building much of the ancient world historians admire today. Their labor disappeared into the monuments. Yet their ordinary lives continued quietly beneath the shadow of those enormous structures. One evening after a long day near a temple construction site, a young laborer returned home covered almost completely in pale dust. His mother barely recognized him at first beneath the coating of limestone powder across his skin and hair. She laughed softly while brushing dust from his face before handing him water. For a brief moment, despite the exhaustion surrounding them both, warmth filled the small room. These ordinary family interactions gave emotional shape to ancient childhood. Love existed not through grand speeches, but through practical care. A father repairing worn sandals for his son late at night. A mother saving slightly sweeter bread portions for younger children. An older sister carrying extra water so a sick sibling could rest. Tenderness survived quietly inside difficult routines. As children grew older, they also became more aware of social differences surrounding them. A poor farming child visiting a wealthy estate might notice the shaded courtyards, painted walls, servants, and abundant food with silent amazement. Likewise, elite children sometimes observed laborers with a strange mixture of distance and dependence. Noble households relied completely on workers who cooked, cleaned, farmed, transported goods, and maintained estates. Ancient Egyptian society remained deeply unequal. Yet every level of society depended on the labor of human hands. Children understood this reality early. A servant girl working inside a wealthy home perhaps noticed how soft the noble children's hands remained compared to her own rough skin from years carrying water and grinding grain. Still, even noble children lived beneath expectation and discipline. A young scribe's son might spend endless hours copying symbols beneath strict supervision while dreaming privately of escaping outside into freer air. Responsibility touched everyone eventually. At night, the Nile often became the quiet center of the world again. After long exhausting days, families gathered near the riverbanks where cooler air drifted across the water. Workers stretched aching muscles while children sat nearby listening to adult conversations carried softly through the darkness. Oil lamps flickered beside small boats tied along the shore. Fish jumped occasionally near the reeds. Stars spread across the sky with astonishing brightness far from the larger cities. For ancient children, these evenings likely felt peaceful even amid hardship. The river offered calmness after labor. Its endless movement seemed older and steadier than human worry. One elderly fisherman sat beside his grandson during such an evening, slowly repairing a net beneath moonlight. The old man's fingers moved carefully despite swollen joints stiffened by decades on the river. The boy watched every motion closely. Not because anyone forced him to, but because one day those same skills would keep him alive. Ancient childhood depended heavily on observation. Adults rarely separated formal teaching from ordinary life. Lessons emerged naturally from proximity. Children watched, copied, repeated, and over time, adulthood entered them quietly. A girl once frightened by cooking fires now managed entire meals confidently. A boy once unable to lift heavy tools now carried them without effort. The transformation happened gradually enough that it often surprised parents when they finally noticed. One mother folding linen clothing after sunset paused suddenly while watching her daughter soothe a crying infant with calm practiced movements. For a brief instant, memory returned sharply. The daughter herself once crying in the same room years earlier. Now she stood at the edge of motherhood already. Time moved quickly beside the Nile. Especially for the poor. Because labor consumed so many hours, years seemed to blend together through routine. Harvest followed flood. Flood followed planting. Childhood slipped quietly beneath the repetition until adulthood stood fully formed almost before anyone realized it. Late one night, long after the village fires burned low, warm wind moved softly through the palm trees while families slept inside mud brick homes still holding traces of daytime heat. Near the riverbank, a teenage boy sat awake alone for a little while longer, watching moonlight shimmer across the Nile. Tomorrow before dawn he would join the adult workers repairing canal walls damaged during the flood season. No one had officially told him he was grown. There had been no ceremony. No announcement. Only more responsibility arriving little by little until childhood became something behind him, fading softly into memory beneath the endless stars of ancient Egypt. Now the Nile grows quiet once more. The long day has faded into darkness, and the warm desert wind moves slowly through the reeds beside the water. Far across the river, a few final oil lamps flicker softly inside mud brick homes where tired families have already fallen asleep. The fields rest beneath the moonlight. The fishing boats drift gently against the shore. The ovens have cooled. The tools lie still. And the children of ancient Egypt, after long days of carrying water, grinding grain, tending fields, learning trades, and slowly growing into the lives waiting for them, finally close their eyes beneath the same stars that watched over countless generations before them. Some sleep beside parents and younger siblings on woven mats still warm from the heat of the day. Some dream softly beside the river breeze drifting through open windows. Some rest with tired hands curled beneath their heads after another ordinary day of work beside the Nile. And somewhere in the darkness, the quiet sound of flowing water continues endlessly through the night. The river keeps moving, patient and eternal. It carries with it the memory of farmers walking before sunrise through cool wet fields. Of girls kneeling beside ovens glowing with firelight. Of boys learning the weight of fishing nets beneath pale morning skies. Of mothers humming softly while grinding grain. Of fathers returning home covered in dust and sunlight. Of childhood fading gently into adulthood one season at a time. No great moment announced the change. No loud ending arrived. Only life continuing forward beneath the ancient Egyptian sky. And now the villages sleep. The temples stand silent beneath the moon. Palm trees sway softly in the warm night air. The stars shine above the Nile exactly as they did thousands of years ago. Quiet. Still. Endless. So let the ancient world drift slowly away now. Let the river carry the final sounds into silence. And rest gently beside the calm waters of the Nile, where history grows soft, distant, and sleepy beneath the endless peaceful night.